Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Good evening.
Good
I will
afternoon.
introduce Catherine in this panel, Catherine Zengerling. Não sei se estou pronunciando bem. You can come. From the University of Freiburg, Germany. And in this panel, we will discuss about governance and science in times of crisis. The part one is responsible urban climate governance in times of crisis, case studies. We are welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Solange. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Let me somewhat check the time. So yeah, thanks for inviting me, Anna. It's been a long time that I've been to Sao Paulo, so it's nice to be back. Yeah, I'm coming with a case study from Hamburg. I've been working in Hamburg for more than 20 years, moved to Freiburg, but the case study is still focused on Hamburg. And I'll talk about how we trace accountability in polycentric climate governance. And this is all related. So you see a picture of Hamburg and mainly the Hamburg harbor. So if you're trying to decarbonize that area, bring that down to 0 until 2050, that's quite a challenge. And I would like to talk about a research project that we are conducting for almost 4 years now, where we are trying to understand accountability chains from global to local scales. So how do we connect the international goals of the Paris Agreement, the global demos, that is the global citizenship that is needs reaching this 1.5 or 2 degree target, and then bridging this all the way down to the local communities that actually have to change to reach that target. So I'll talk about how we conceptualize that and try to trace it in very different jurisdictions, and then I'll present some interim results at the Paris regime level, EU and Germany, and then zoom into the case study of Hamburg. So this is how we tried to conceptualize our accountability analysis. We tried to look into so how the city level is actually embedded in vertical and horizontal governance. And so the vertical governance is the one looking at the multi-level governance. So from the international regime to the European Union regime and the German regime, you could enter the state level here, make it more complicated. And the orange arrows are what we call the accountability chains. So how are these, which chains are existing and how are they designed from a legal perspective? Like, here in the internal way, we look into how accountability within Hamburg or whatever city climate action planning is organized. And here we look into the accountability chains that grow in city networks and in relationships among cities. And the analysis has 4 pillars. We look into responsibility. So who takes over what kind of responsibility against whom to reach what kind of targets? How is that assessed? How transparently is the data dealt with? Who has access to the data? And then finally, who is participating in decision-making and with which form of power in decision-making? And because we would like to understand the diversity in different jurisdictions, we picked 8 different jurisdictions, Canada, the US, Brazil, Nigeria, Egypt, Germany, China, and India, and then the 8 anchor cities in those 8 countries. And we picked those countries because they are home to more than half of the global urban population. So all of these jurisdictions have a high degree of urban population. So it's important to understand how cities are equipped with tools and powers and funding to actually contribute to reaching these international targets. And here's the interim findings for those 3 levels of government. So what we see in the international legal regime is for international legal regimes quite innovative, because in the old times, international law like the Kyoto Protocol only addressed the member states. And nowadays we have a world where we have these extra arrows, these extra accountability chains, where the Paris Agreement does not only communicate with states, but it starts to communicate with non-state actors and sub-state actors like cities. And some countries also do that through their NDCs, but not many. Like the European Union, for example, doesn't do that. Brazil did this in the past, but not with the last NDC. And we see that through this transnational outreach, there has been quite a dynamic. More than 11,000 cities signed on to that agenda and are trying to work towards these Paris Agreement targets. First, mainly focused on mitigation, and there is also more and more on adaptation, which is tracked also under this GCAP platform, the Global Climate Action Platform. However, if we have to evaluate the status quo of the accountability, it's to note that cities are not addressees of the Paris Agreement, only the states are addressees, but they are embedded through this Marrakesh partnership on a voluntary basis, and city networks, they work as aggregators under the GCAP platform so that they could facilitate this enormous growth over the years. We also observe an increase in ambition over time. So currently, many of those cities actually signed on to the net zero 2050 target. That was not the target from the beginning on. There were like 70% reduction, 80% reduction, and now many of them actually want to strive towards net zero by 2050. There's not yet a comprehensive tracking, so we don't know if this is a greenwashing website, which is all based on cheating, basically, or if it's worth anything. But we see a growth in also accountability tracking. So, for example, they developed the recognition and accountability framework under the GCAP, and several different initiatives try to get the accounting of greenhouse gas emissions more precise, more transparent, more open. So it's evolving. And then some states are addressing their cities in their NDCs. Looking at the European Union, the EU has also new chains to cities, but they are all voluntary. And maybe the most important initiative here is this under Horizon Europe program, this mission of 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. So there's now 100 cities that get funded to reach climate neutrality by 2030, which is rather early and quite ambitious, and we don't know if they will make it or not, but they want to produce lighthouse examples, front runners, to then learn from them and then start to diffuse that. So this is science initiative. In general, the EU still allows for climate harmful investments in cities. So the topic is not ideally streamlined, but is a bit more like better streamlined than it has been in the past. So there's some evolvement. At the German national level, cities have quite a large scope of action, not as large as in Brazil, because we don't have 3 levels of government as you have it here, but we only have 2 levels, just the nation state and the 16 federal states, and cities are part of the states. And so they come with less power than in Brazil, but they have quite, through this right to local self-government, quite a large room of action. And now when we had the climate change issue, the national legislature actually wanted to oblige municipalities to do climate action planning in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but it couldn't do so because our constitution prohibits to refer new tasks to municipalities, because in 2006 they negotiated that it's enough. We have enough tasks. We're not going to take any new tasks. And so, for a while it was difficult. Now the legislator still in 2023 came up with 2 new laws, one on decarbonizing heating systems in Germany and one on adaptation, and actually found a workaround. So now the national law is obliging the 16 federal states to oblige the municipalities to do heating planning and adaptation planning. And so because it's really new, we don't have any experience yet with how this is going to work. So all the climate planning that happened in the past, also adaptation planning, is voluntary. And some cities did that, but now, from now on, most of the 11,000 German municipalities have to do that. And we are engaged in a research project here on that heating planning thing, and I'm also curious to see how this evolves. We will accompany 10 municipalities in Germany in 3 different states in their progress on how they will do this heating planning. in the next 3 years. Funding schemes are still voluntary, but with this obligation, like in the German law, if the state or any higher level of government gives you a new task, it also has to fund you actually do that. So the cities, most of the mayors actually wanted to have the obligation. They were lobbying for getting this obligation to do climate mitigation and climate adaptation plan, because with that obligation comes the money. And now, yeah, they will, through the national level and through the state level, they will receive more funding than they had in the past to actually fulfill these new tasks. Now, zooming into Hamburg, Hamburg had this idea of transformative climate action planning over the years. They started quite early, voluntarily, and had the idea every couple of years to renew their climate action plan and then step by step reach that 2050 vision and continuously go through this development, implementation, monitoring, adjustment circle. And this is the last renewal. They had the last revision in 2023. And as you see, they translated the climate action plan, the older one, but the newer one is not translated yet. I don't know why. I'll check. It would be nice to have it in English too. But they are more ambitious in their targets. So with every climate action plan they passed, they got more ambitious in the reduction targets. So nowadays they want to have a 70% CO2 reduction by 2030, and they want to be CO2 neutral in 2045. This is the same target as the national legislator has. So they kept up pace with what Germany promised after this constitutional court ruling that where they lost. This is how they would like to reach the target. In terms of energy transition, they are working, supporting also the coal phase out in the city of Hamburg. The largest coal power plant already went off grid. They want to produce new H2-ready gas power plants. They want to expand renewable electricity and also, very importantly, produce more storage capacity. And they also have green hydrogen on the agenda. We had a very critical presentation on green hydrogen. So yeah, it's here. They actually tried to produce it in Germany, but the Lighthouse project to produce it just not so long ago went bankrupt, actually. So there's no, although there went lots of funding money into that program, it didn't finance so far. So maybe in the future it'll work, but they tried hard and it didn't work out. And in private households, they want to integrate more renewables and private heating grids. They want to reach a higher refurbishment rate, like most of the building stock is old. So the refurbishment rate is super important to actually reaching the targets. They want to have climate neutral new construction and improve also user behavior. Industry, especially the energy intense industry, also hopes for green hydrogen, but also try to enhance their own production of renewables. In the transport sector, as always, modal shift electrification of public transport, as here, again, hydrogen and e-fuels and heavy goods and transports, and we can critically discuss this later on. This is just what they write in their climate action plan. Together with the plan, they had a revision of the Hamburg climate law, which was quite helpful because the plan as such is not legally binding. And this law makes part of the plan legally binding, which is really helpful for the implementation in times of crisis. So the overall and the sectoral targets of this revised plan are legally binding. And the set of mitigation and adaptation measures are also legally binding. So, for example, there's an obligation to use solar panels on rooftops that need to cover 30% of the roof space. Then an obligation to put them also on, like this is for new buildings and this is for refurbished roofs. And then they will have an obligation to combine PV and green roofs as a compromise of mitigation and adaptation. 2027 onwards, maybe late, but it became an obligation now. And also public buildings have to be, the lighthouse examples to do things quicker than the others. What have we reached over the time? So we started out within the 1990 with a 12.4 CO2 emissions per capita. And now that was the Corona time here, and we made it back to 7.5. I don't know if you know, but Sao Paulo is, I think, somewhere between 1 and 2 tons per capita. So we're quite far away from that. And it's also, of course, it's not that we reached nothing, But to reach the Paris target, we also would need to be somewhere between 1 and 2, ideally at 1 ton per capita. This depends always on density as well. That's also one reason maybe why accounting in Sao Paulo works well in such a dense city. But the electricity mix and also how you drive is much cleaner than the electricity mix in Germany. So yeah, we are here. We need to go down to 1 or 2. So there's still a long way to go. And the low-hanging fruits are harvested. So it's getting more and more difficult to also reach the next steps. They are trying to do a good job in implementing measures and like keep track of what they have implemented and what not. So since this is well new, so this green part is under implementation. This is already done, the blue stuff here, and is being prepared. So trying to renew this over time and keep track of what they've been doing. They also, in the law, installed a climate council. And guess who's in the council? So Anita is in the council, and Peter Fröhle is also in the council. You might have met them before in the conference. So it's 15 scientists, most of them from Hamburg, and they publish reports every once in a while on specific topics. And the latest one was focused on adaptation. And some of the recommendations were to consider mitigation adaptation measures jointly, like to consider the synergies, but also the contradictions, and find good solutions for that. Develop a more fine-grained adaptation and implement a strategy and also an implementation plan. Have a separate climate adaptation law, because the city of Hamburg doesn't have that so far. Work towards a just transition. Consider also the external effects, like beyond Germany and beyond Hamburg and beyond Germany. Strengthen blue and green infrastructure. That this is the general points. They are more. This is a long report, so they flesh this out in a way more detailed manner. Now, what's the toolbox of the municipality to actually reach those targets? There's a whole bunch of things the city can do in terms of concept development, formal instruments, formal sense in private law, so-called informal planning, and also different incentive systems. And I just would like to show you how they work with competition in the Hafen City, an area that is newly developed in Hamburg. And they came up with a quite modern process of tendering. So they required that everyone who wants to submit a bid for any new building in the Hafen City has to fulfill a certain level of minimum requirements. And they tried to keep that minimum requirements quite high. So everyone has to provide 40% of subsidized housing in that living floor area. Then they all had to fulfill the platinum standard, so the highest standard of the Hafen City Eco Label. That's a bit like LEED. They had to participate in smart mobility model neighborhoods, so try to avoid cars in the first place. If cars, then shared electric cars. They had to use open ground floor design. Buildings had to be barrier-free. An obligation to connect to the mostly renewably run district heating. They had to participate in quarter management. And the new thing for Germany was that 70% of the evaluation criteria were given for the concept and just 30% on price. And in the past, it had to be 100% price. So you could not consider the quality of the concept, and they flipped this. And with this, they could consider really good offers. And then voluntarily, you can have the chance to score some extra percentages if you go even beyond the standard. And if you have low gray energy and cradle-to-cradle approaches, like look into the footprints of your projects. So if I'd have to summarize the implementation challenges, climate action plans as such are rather weak instruments because they are strategic and don't have any teeth as such as an instrument. So the implementation highly depends on the cooperation between the key sectoral departments of the administration and also the lower levels of government. Like the city of Hamburg has 7 districts. And by now, also every one of those 7 districts has an own climate action plan. And you had to be in constant cooperation with them because every one of these measures has a locality. And if the people in charge of this locality were not on board by making the plan, they are not so much interested in actually implementing anything of that. yeah, opportunities of these climate action plans are that they are rather detailed. The measures are quite detailed, and each measure is matched by a certain budget also. So they took a part of the household to mirror the measures. As I said, the districts also came up with their climate action plans. There was a bit of a transformative wave where some districts start and the others said, okay, now we actually have to do one too, because otherwise our standing is not good in the city. Then they could finance through the national funding programs, they could finance climate managers at the city level and in each district. So there's always a person responsible for this coordination and mainstreaming work. They did a lot of participatory planning, trying to get like cross-sectoral administration, like cross-sectoral participation in administration, and also including city and district scales. And they were trying also to work with citizens and other private key stakeholders, like the big companies, the big industrial players. The harbor, of course, is a big thing in Hamburg and very challenging to decarbonize. And then what was very important also, that whatever wherever the society was far enough to actually turn something into a legal requirement. For example, now oil heating is forbidden. You cannot build a new oil heating in your cellar. It's just taken out of that game. Arguably, it was taken out of the game 20 years too late, but now it's out of the game. So they could advance this, so they had to produce some conditions that are not to negotiate anymore. So which is very important, because then you can focus on others, like on more innovative things to move forwards with the transition. So yeah, if you're interested in what we did in that research project, you find a couple of publications here, and I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward for questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Catherine, in fact, holds the chair of transformation.
A Catherine tem a cadeira de transformação e de sistemas energéticos transformativos e recursos humanos na Universidade de Friburgo, na Alemanha. E ela tem um PhD também na Universidade de Hamburgo e um mestrado da Universidade de Michigan. A pesquisa atual foca no papel das cidades
and transition law in a multi-level governance system, climate litigation, and climate change and trade. Thank you very much for your exposition and these case studies that you bring to us. And so I will just call the second lecturer, Ricardo Alcântara, da Universidade do Rio Grande do Norte, Natal.
From the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, Natal.
Obrigada, Ricardo.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Eu estava invertendo a apresentação.
I changed the presentation, but while they are presenting the slides, let me do the opposite with our Brazilian panelist. Ricardo is a professor of climate law, environmental law, vinculated to the Department of Public Law from the University of Rio Grande do Norte since 1994, a master and doctor in bioethics.
Bem-vindo, Ricardo.
We are welcome and also prosecutor. We are very welcome, Ricardo.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you.
Prazer enorme estar aqui.
It's a big honor to be here.
E com todo respeito a
And with all due respect to Catherine and Professor Gianpaolo, today it's the legal part, so it is necessarily the most boring during the week. So when the proposal of the panel to talk about climatic governance, I immediately decided to talk about climate justice and the dimensions of it. And I brought two two things to support this in terms of a phenomenon that is not much studied, which is chronic exhibition to heat, less studied than the heat waves and less studied than the heat islands, né? And also urban. So just recently, some scientists started working on this chronic exhibition, which is something that the people in the place I live in get more affected by. It's not a case, but it is a proposal that was presented a few days ago on INCT, Climapolis. I believe it was approved, right, Professor Sutiti? And we are going to work a little bit more on that, trying to experiment, learn more about it, consider these inequalities, these thermal inequalities in schools. So, like I said, the main idea is how to incorporate the dimensions of justice into climate, the urban climate governance, especially if we consider some groups have an unproportional onus of these climate changes. And there is an urgent need for these dimensions of justice, these justice pillars, to be considered in adaptation plans in cities, the climate adaptation plans for the cities. This chronic exhibition to heat, just as an introduction, it is a hidden disaster. According to this Australian author who lives in a place in Australia, which is basically burning people's judgment, both such as in the semi-arid in the northeastern region. A professor reported, and I'm going to talk about climate justice from a legal perspective, but almost all the lectures of this event were about climate justice. Many of them were about climate justice, even though people didn't mention directly climate justice. And this event is less studied than the heat zones, for example, that happened, the heat waves like in France, where they kill many people. Here in Brazil, it also happens. Tomorrow we are going to see, but this is not, there is no reference or it's not considered in public policies. And I'm going to use a classroom as a real world experiment. So what urban climate governance is? This governance is exactly when public, private, and civil society actors and institutions articulate, civil society articulate, in order to have climate goals and to exercise influence and authority how to imagine urban climate and the management process and implementation process. The panel also asks us to talk about the crisis, because governance, urban governance for climate in times of crisis. And for this crisis, this slide, I'm going to go very briefly because everybody knows in detail what it is, environmental crisis, climate crisis. I'm not going to insist on it, but these last two, I think, deserve a few comments. We are now living a democracy crisis. This is evident. Democracies are being destroyed. The corrosion of institutionality that has reached many countries, it is a world phenomenon, and this effectively has played a big relevance when it comes to climate justice, because once the participative process and the hearings of the society foundations is made more difficult in a process of democratic crisis, and also inequality crisis, which is also something very difficult. We participated in the visits yesterday, and we could see very clearly that. I went to Morumbi, a very beautiful region, relatively comfortable, thermal comfort, and then we went to Paraisópolis with all those problems we know that exist there. But
Justiça climática.
what is climate
Nem
injustice?
todo mundo sofre
Everyone does not suffer equal
os
harms,
mesmos
the same
impactos das mudanças
impacts
climáticas.
of
Isso
climate
pode falar
change.
de países,
And this we can
pode falar,
talk about
claro,
countries, of
os
course.
do hemisfério
For
norte,
the
eles,
north,
normalmente,
né,
eles são
countries
mais
in the
responsáveis
north,
pelos
they are
países do
more
hemisfério sul,
responsible than those
os
from the
países do sul
south
global.
hemisphere,
A
né,
gente
the
tem
global
gerações,
south. We
e
can talk about
gerações
generations,
atuais
and
são
now
mais
the current generations are
impactos
more,
pela mudança climática
they are,
em relação às
let's
gerações
say, more
anteriores,
to be
às gerações
blamed for
futuras.
in relation to the
A gente
future
pode falar isso em
generations.
relação a
We
espaço,
can talk about this
indivíduos.
when it comes to
Então,
space, to
a justiça
individuals.
climática
So
denota
climate
uma justa
justice
distribuição
denotes
e
fair
partilha
distribution
do
and
sofrimento
sharing
das
of the
responsabilidades pela
suffering
mudança
and
climática.
responsibilities for
Pelo
climate
princípio
change.
climático,
So there
e
is a
do regime
principle
climático
of climate
internacional,
and
que é muito
the
interessante,
international
que
regimen, which is interesting and which is
existem
important.
responsabilidades comuns,
They
porém
say that
diferenciadas.
the common
E a gente fala de
responsibilities, but different.
mudança
Né?
climática, a
So
gente
when
pode
we
fazer
talk about
uma
climate
base
justice,
desse
we can maybe
possível
use the same principle and say that
porém diferenciados.
common suffering, but
Todos
different
nós
ones.
sofremos de alguma maneira.
We all suffer somehow in this
Às
room,
vezes até uma
sometimes
ansiedade,
even anxiety or a problem of like mental problem, like anxiety when it comes to climate change, but of course we do not suffer the same things of people who live there and in poverty. So there is a common struggle because everybody will suffer somehow, but of course that this is not the same. It is these are where the inequalities are and the criteria of justice in order to try and minimize this. So climate justice is an ethical principle for public decision making that must be considered for climate policies based on these three principles. The fair access to facilities.
Agora me faltou a palavra.
I forgot the word.
Enfim, acesso aos bens.
So the fair access to facilities, a fair exposure to climate change consequences, its impact and consequences, and also fair distribution of responsibilities. The key aspects of climate justice, I'm going very briefly with that because I don't want to waste time with that, but there is an equal suffering, burden, a huge burden and responsibility, né, which is different between communities. Some groups, some more individuals are more sensitive to it, and due to political, economic, and social dynamics, some communities have poor and inadequate facilities to cope, to deal with climate change. And with more people living in the global south, the mechanisms of disadvantage in these economic and political systems will exacerbate these impacts and this suffering over people. And unequal climate change policies and uneven this infrastructure is the word I could not remember that. So what the three dimensions of climate justice are, or four, depending on the author. The first two are more the most famous, this distributive justice and procedural justice. So for example, Professor Fernando, when he said his case, he talked a lot about procedure justice, even though he didn't use this word, the same terminology. Professor Moema also heard, I listened to her from YouTube. And these two others, recognition and restorative justice, are more modern approaches on climate justice, and I'm going to explain each of them very briefly. So the dimensions of distributive justice, of climate justice, this proposes two questions. How can an ethical society distribute its resources in the context of climate change?
das emergências climáticas. Como pode uma sociedade minimizar
How
os
can
efeitos
urban citizens minimize the effects, the uneven effects of the climate change? I have only 5 minutes to talk about something that Aristotle and was told that they took 30 years to talk about, but I would like to focus on distributive and recognition justice. Something we have to consider is the intersectionality, because this is linked to this recognition justice, the need that the systemic injustice in the context of cities are considered in the process, the urban planning process. Urban planning process and urban governance. And this intersectionality produces terrible things, such as, what is intersectionality for the ones who are not very familiar with the topic? This is when you have a series of vulnerabilities that related to gender, ethnicity, race, sexuality, the economic issues, low income, migration status, these economical disparities, and it can also cross with some, it can be entwined with this space, when it comes to space, space segregation, that would tackle the most vulnerable. This dimension, this intersectionality, like I said, has some terrible cases in terms of justice that we do not take into account. Most of the people do not take into account and have no idea of it, such as women in chronic disposition to heat in many countries throughout the world, who would avoid going to the bathroom, avoid drinking water, because they cannot expose continuously going to the bathroom, because these bathrooms they use are precarious ones. They can have some abuse, for example, sexual abuse or harassment. There is a case in Rio, which was studied by an author of women, transgender women that decide not to drink water during chronic exhibition, because they don't want to go to the bathroom. Every time they enter into a restroom, they have they suffer some kind of abuse, some harassment, and we have no idea of it. And this is the intersectionality, okay? So here, these are the points that I'm going to skip. I will focus more on the case that we intend to measure there in Natal. So this is a state public school in Natal. Those Vanderlei, they left from the air conditioning dream to the nightmare of sauna. So this school has now the temperature in the classrooms is around 40 degrees, and scientists there from our city, scientists, they promised to install the air conditionings there, and before checking the installation, electrical installation of school, they closed the school. And when the air conditioning got there to being installed, they saw that the installations, electrical installation, were not prepared for air conditioning. And then all the openings, all the ventilation was closed, and then the students studied for the whole semester in this kind of condition. So the idea is to have a transdisciplinary research on it, and this is the good part, because everything that is transdisciplinary seems interesting to me, and to examine these issues of climate justice and try with some architecture interventions, low-cost ones, minimize heat in these schools, especially in this school, which is the case study, and to then assess the educational performance of these kids that is highly affected due to the chronic exposition to heat. There are many studies, this is one of them, which is education outcomes in the era of global climate change. And there is also the possibility of assessing also physical and mental health. So in INCT Climapolis, we have this opportunity to strengthen these interactions, to foster interactions and knowledge exchange between urban planners, urban designers, scientists, professors, in order to conduct empiric research on climate justice and urban adaptations. I included here the specific objectives that must be there, part of the project. Of course, it has to be discussed with my colleague, Marisa, who participate also on INCT in this department. We do everything we do is together. And we have here a possibility of having these correlations between climate justice and adaptive interventions in urban schools. And finally, I believe that dreaming right now is revolutionary. With the ascension of extreme right, the erosion of democracy and inequalities. And I do believe that with some solutions, we can minimize people's suffering. Sometimes we don't need a solution or reinventing the wheel or high cost solution. This photograph is from India, from an office that is anti-studio, and they try to recover these elements, architectonic elements that were very, very important for thousands of years. This is nothing but a natural air conditioning that uses Venturi's effect. And with these drops of water, it can reduce the temperature up to 6 degrees. It is already there being used in India. So the idea is that we can maybe somehow interfere positively in school and show that it can be replicated, because many schools in Rio Grande do Norte look like prisons. Look like, like furnaces, and I believe this is climate justice for the adaptation. Once we cannot stop climate changes that were established in the Paris Agreement, but we have the possibility to minimize suffering with some low-cost solutions. And this should become, of course, public policy in the municipality of Natal. But in the municipality of Natal, there is no regulation on the mitigation or climate adaptation. In the state of Rio Grande do Norte, where the capital city, Natal, is located, we do not have a climate policy. So what happens in Hamburgo, for example, that you are trying to mitigate this, but there in Natal, there is nothing like that. But it doesn't mean that we cannot get it. No? We don't need to wait for some legislation for it. At some point, we can start about climate litigants to introduce this in urban planning. All these justice issues, or the lack of planning, the lack of the implementation of those measures. So all this is here. Me, Marisa, and the other members, we are all very engaged to do this. Thanks to Professor Judith. So with that, thank you, and sorry for exceeding the time I have to speak.
Eu próprio estava morrendo de sede aqui.
I was very thirsty here.
Obrigada, professor Ricardo.
Thank you, Professor Ricardo. Now I will immediately hand it over to Professor João Paulo Ismânio. He is now the public prosecutor. It's in English, so I will try to continue in English.
From the Public Prosecutor's Office of the State of São Paulo and full professor at the Faculty of Law and the Master's and Doctorate Program in Political and Economic Law at this university. He was Attorney General of the state of São Paulo from 2016 to 2020. He has experience in areas of citizenship, public policy, and criminal law, with an emphasis on economic criminal law and diffuse interests.
Vejam, Paulo. Obrigado.
Boa tarde a todos, uma alegria
Good
poder participar
afternoon,
desse
everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to participate in such a relevant event, and especially to talk about legal issues, because these, like my colleague said, they are not the best ones. These are the most boring, but undoubtedly really necessary in order to find an effective climate governance here in our country and worldwide. So I will try to speak in 15 minutes. I decided to discuss the case of Porto Alegre with you. Actually, the case of Rio Grande do Sul. I know that the professors Carlo Tucci and Daniela Benfica already talked with you about that in the beginning of our seminar, our event. But now I would like to work more the idea with this aspect of climate governance, and especially to bring the action of the public minister in face of the problems that took place there in Rio Grande do Sul, and then triggered a series of a national understanding of the public ministry when it comes to how the prosecutors in the whole country must act in face of these events of climate crisis. And of course, this fits the idea of governance. As everybody knows, when we talk about governance, we talk about a system of laws and actions and processes and procedures that will involve the public sector, the private sector, the people, and the companies. And within this perspective of governance is that the public minister is a representative of the society in order to get this better governance in the system. First, legally speaking, we have to include this governance in the legal system of the country and insert this in the state, the constitution, and today, as it is said, and also the environmental state. So this is an expression, a German expression, the Umweltrechtsstaat. Sorry for my German, but this is the idea that
Alemanha ganha o foro do conhecimento de todos. Então, a ideia, né,
so the idea of this undoubtedly is to have the idea of the constitution principles of environmental protection. So we have to insert this idea of protection in our principles of the federal constitution, the case that I am discussing today, but the one way or the other, it is included in the legal system of every country in order to protect the environment. So our constitution is really comprehensive. It brings, it's very clear when it comes to environmental protection. There is a whole specific articles about this system to protect the environment. It starts on the 225, the article that ensures the environment as fundamental right common to all the citizens, and then it is it breaks down into information which is more specific with its principles in order to protect the environment. And among these principles, we can mention the sustainable development. In our country, it is a principle in the Constitution. We can talk about environmental solidarity that makes everybody work together for the protection of the environment. And in this idea of solidarity, there is also intergeneration that would make them keep the environment conditions for the future generations, prevention, precaution, that demand for the behavior of all this public and private protection system, it is something in order to protect the environment. So when it comes to laws and the Constitution, of course, you wouldn't be here discussing this, but it is insufficient. When it comes to this cannot stop effectively what they intend to. Of course, that for us to leave this and reach the reality, we need a whole governance system. So all the members, everyone can act the same, and then it implies in tests, economical, social, politics, and this is why we need to find these best ways and discuss these governance wishes once, even though the legal system is good, in the case of Brazil it is, we do not find this reflective effectively in our daily lives, which is also not only, it doesn't happen only in Brazil, it happens worldwide. So with this idea, based on this idea that it's necessary to leave this legal environment and think about the reality, we have to talk about the ecological dimension of citizenship. Every citizen in every country, the citizens worldwide, they have their rights ensured but in order for these rights to be, they needed the reality to understand that every citizen has an ecological dimension, an environmental dimension that will ensure their existence and dignity of their existence, the conditions. So their existence must take place.
Dentro dessa perspectiva é que nós podemos,
and in
então,
this perspective,
começar a
we can then start discussing these environmental issues of environmental crisis, especially in the urban environment. Brazil has additional problems, additional difficulties when we deal with environmental crisis, and this is due to irregular occupation of our land, our public spaces. Brazil has, as a historical process, the housing as a deficit. People live in improper places. We have a historical process of irregular occupation of our urban land. And when those climate crises take place, like my colleague said, when it comes to environmental justice, climate justice, they show to be even more serious because this fraction of the population who live in slums or that occupied places of environmental protection or places where housing shouldn't be there, but it was. So this population suffers more than the population who do not live in these bad conditions.
So this is one of the problems we have to face. And this makes that the impact of the environmental crisis shows more significant. As we saw in Rio Grande do Sul, it showed with a lot of clarity, because for those who live close to the river and in poorer areas of the city, they lost everything. And obviously, other regions of the city that are better constituted, they had less impact, despite the fact that the impact is for everyone. This irregular occupation brings a difficulty not only in sense of livelihood and consequence of the crisis, but is a difficulty for transport, sanitation, health, education. So when we get to the dimension of citizenship, we understand the deficit Brazil has because of the occupation, the irregular occupation of the space. So we need, as my colleague was mentioning, and professor that talked earlier, measures for climate. And within this idea, the control agencies need to develop agendas for the preservation to happen and for us to have a strategy of prevention to environmental damages. And this is what is the letter to Porto Alegre that generated this agenda for the Public Ministry of Brazil Prevention, mostly working, if not to make effective a change, but at least to diminish the impact of this climate crisis we're living. So we can notice that this Porto Alegre letter that I'm talking about, it was an encounter of the Public Ministry of Brazil in Porto Alegre as soon as was possible to get to Porto Alegre to make this meeting on regards of the environmental situations that happened there. And several measures were discussed and approved in an institutional meeting. And we can notice that all of them are related to prevention, most of them. So it is about democratization of information for people to know what's going on, for people to get training, simulations, how to defend themselves in these moments of climate crisis, also the monitoring systems and alert on disasters and the environmental damages that we have. We need to build systems that alert population, not only alert the population, but they are accessible and they are able to ensure decisions that are fast for protection of people and their assets. The protocols need to be clear. The public agencies need to know what they have to do with a lot of clarity, because at the moment that a flooding happens, it's very fast. We don't have time for the people even to leave their own car or their own home. And sometimes it's necessary for the public sector or private sector to have the conscious of what it's needed to do in every situation. There is a need for protocols for the telephone systems and other internet systems. Communication can be stay at work. We need to work with protection organs, because sometimes we see cities that didn't have any structure to face these disasters. We need a structuring on civil defense and training. We need mapping of risk areas integrated to master plans. We need the country, for the country to find a prevention way that are articulated and all involved.
diretores de
master
municípios,
plans of
integração de planos de
municipalities, integration
contingência,
of contingency plans,
construções, infraestrutura, como
functions,
falou também os que me
infrastructure,
antecederam,
as we said
enfim,
before,
combater desmatamento, conversão de áreas verdes em
face
outras áreas,
conversion in of green areas in other
sobretudo,
areas,
cuidar da
and
ocupação
above
das
all,
áreas de
take
risco,
care of the
né? A gente
occupation
tem, aqui,
of the
infelizmente,
risky
como eu disse,
areas.
processo
Here,
histórico
unfortunately, I
bastante
have an
complicado,
historical
né?
process that is
E
a
o que
bit
é pior,
complicated.
depois que a área é
And what
ocupada,
is
vem a
worse, after the
urbanização da
area
área.
being
E aí,
occupied,
além de
it
tudo,
comes the
a
urbanization.
permanência das
So
pessoas
the
em áreas de
permanence
risco,
of
né?
people in risk
Não é
areas.
porque ela foi urbanizada que ela deixa de ser
It's
uma
not
área de
because
risco.
it's
Quando
urbanized that
ocorre a
it's
emergência
not
climática, ainda que
an
tenha sido urbanizada a área, há
risky area
sofrimento já
anymore.
para aquelas
We
pessoas
have
que
a
permaneceram
suffering of the
em
people
situação
that
de risco.
stayed
Então, isso tudo
in
tem que
risky
ser
situations.
mapeado, discutido,
So we need to
né?
map this and
Realizado um plano
discuss
diretor para a
and
solução
have a master
dessas
plan
questões que
for
vão
the
continuar
solution of
ocorrendo.
these
Então,
situations that are
nós temos aí
continuing to
várias,
happen.
e prestem atenção
We
que são
have
medidas que o Ministério Público
several
brasileiro
measures that the
pleiteia,
public
né, para que
ministry
possa haver,
is
então, uma integração de todos os
dealing for
setores
us to
envolvidos.
have an
Para quem não
integration
é do
of
Brasil,
every
o Ministério
sector
Público
involved.
brasileiro
For
tem, por
those who
força
are not from
constitucional, uma
Brazil, we
atuação que
have
não é
the
apenas
public ministry
criminal.
is not
O
only
Ministério Público
criminal,
brasileiro
the
tem uma
public
atuação em
ministry,
áreas de
it
defesa de direitos
is
humanos,
has
em área
some
de
work
defesa de
on
direitos
area
sociais,
of social
sobretudo quando eles se
defense,
revelam nessa perspectiva
mostly when
coletiva,
we have this
difusa,
collective
e há
perspective
instrumentos de
and
proteção
we have
específicos, como
protection
ação civil
instruments that
pública,
are
inquérito civil, para
specific
efetivar, né,
for
essa
civil work
proteção.
to make this protection
E essa
effective.
carta de Curitiba, perdão, Curitiba, essa
And
carta do Rio
this
Grande do Sul,
letter,
gerou
Rio Grande do Sul, generated
manual de atuação.
a manual.
Eu falei de carta de Curitiba porque a primeira carta de
I
Ministério
said
Público é de
Carta of Curitiba,
né? A
the
primeira
letter of
carta que
Curitiba,
une o
because the
Ministério Público do
first
Brasil, então tá
letter
na minha
was
cabeça,
from
mas
Curitiba.
a carta é lá de Porto Alegre.
However,
Mas
it's from Porto Alegre.
esse manual de
But this
atuação, ele é
manual,
nacional.
it is
Ele é do
national.
Conselho Nacional do
It is
Ministério
of the
Público,
National
que é o órgão
Council
de
of the
controle
Public
nacional do
Ministry,
Ministério
which is the
Público. E
national
ele
organ
serve
of control.
não só de
And
orientação,
it
mas é uma norma
serves not only as an
obrigatória para
orientation, but
todos os
is a
membros do
mandatory norm
Ministério
for
Público,
everyone
né, que
involved
atuam nessa área
that
ambiental.
who
Não vai
work
dar
and
tempo de eu
play in
mostrar
this
toda essa
area.
cartilha,
I
todo
won't
esse
have
manual, mas pelo
time
menos
to
o
show
sumário
all the
para
manual,
que
but at
vocês
least
percebam
this
a
summary
amplitude dele.
for you to
Ele
understand
trata dos
its amplitude.
sistemas
It talks about the
de
systems,
defesa
defense
ambiental,
systems,
ele trata do
environmental,
mapeamento de
on
risco,
mapping of
ele trata de
risks,
cadastros, de
registration,
configuração de riscos, de planos
risk
de atuação, de
consideration,
realização de políticas
working
públicas,
plans for
né,
public
sobretudo as
policies,
políticas ambientais,
mostly
planos de
environmental
ação,
policies,
evidentemente,
action plans,
inclusive um plano de saúde, porque
including a health plan,
de uma
because
atuação de saúde física,
we
inclusive saúde
have
mental para todos aqueles que são
even
atingidos
for
pela crise
mental health
climática,
as well that are related to this
e
climate
por aí vai,
crisis.
não é?
And so
São
far,
acessos aos locais
so these
atingidos,
accesses to
são
the
protocolos,
affected
são
locals,
soluções que precisam ser
protocols,
encontradas em cada
solutions
setor,
that
né?
need to be
E também
found.
não só previsão de medidas
And not
de
only
prevenção. Existem medidas
measures for action, but also
para quando a
prevention
crise está
for
ocorrendo,
when
quando
the
o
crisis
desastre
is
está
happening,
ocorrendo,
when the
enfim,
disaster is
seja
happening,
enchente, seja chuva, seja
if
lá o
it's
que for,
flooding,
que
rains,
ocorra no
fire,
desastre,
whatever it
na crise
is
ambiental, né?
in the
Também
environmental
tem uma série de
crisis. So we
medidas
have several measures
precisam ocorrer,
that need to
assim
happen.
como após o
As well
desastre
as
também tem
after the
medidas que precisam
disaster,
ser
we
tomadas,
need
né?
measures to be
Desocupação
taken.
das áreas,
Disoccupation of
médicas,
areas, medical attention,
questões que envolvem assessorias de
things that
reconstrução,
involve rebuilding
assessoria de habitação,
agencies,
protocolo de
habitation,
enfim,
protocols.
hoje o Ministério Público
Today,
tem
the public ministry
roteiro, né,
has a
para essa
script
crise ambiental.
for
Ele
this
vem
type of
tarde, né?
crises.
Infelizmente ele veio depois de uma grave crise, de uma várias questões
Unfortunately,
bastante
we
graves,
came a bit
mas antes
late
tarde do
after
que nunca.
a lot
É
of
preciso que
emergencies
exista
happen.
e é
It's
preciso que
important
todos
to
os
exist and that every
do privado
sector, being
acompanhem
public
esse
or
mesmo
private,
procedimento,
to
né?
work with the
Que os
same procedure.
governos,
The
que os
governments,
prefeitos, as
the
prefeituras, os
mayors,
estados, a
city
União,
halls, state,
todos
central government, every private sector, companies,
concessionárias de serviço público, né, seja de telefonia, seja de luz,
dealers
seja de
for light,
precisam
telephone
ter
agencies.
protocolos de atuação,
They need
porque
to have
como nós estamos vendo,
protocols
essa crise
because
climática
as we
veio para
see
ficar,
this
né,
climate
e ela deve
crisis
ter,
is going to
se
stay.
nós conseguirmos reverter,
And if we are able
questões aí que
to
envolvem aquecimento
decrease
global
some
e outros desgastes
figures
ambientais,
and
talvez a gente consiga reverter
undo
isso,
some of the harm, maybe
mas
we'll
ainda
be
que isso seja
able
possível,
to
muitos anos ainda ocorrerão
solve,
de
but
crise
we
climática
have
se nós
a
não
lot of
conseguirmos
years to
reverter, nós
come
vamos ver
with
esse quadro ainda
crisis.
piorado,
And if we're not able
até o
to
final
reverse,
desse século. Então,
we're going to have
agradeço
this
muito,
up
estou à
to the end of
disposição,
this
evidentemente,
century.
para qualquer
I would like to
questionamento,
thank
qualquer questão
everyone.
que
I'm
os senhores
available
acham
for any
importante, mas eu
questions or
reitero
doubts or
a
comments.
importância. Eu queria cumprimentar a FAU-Mackenzie,
And I
né,
still want
evidentemente
to
uma excelente discussão,
congratulate
profunda, né,
FAU-Mackenzie
realmente
and
de
this
excelente
discussion that is very
qualidade,
opportune and
né,
excellent
meu
quality.
cumprimento a todos os
And
professores que participam desse
my
evento. Muito
salutation
obrigado.
to every professor involved. Thank you.
Eu vou solicitar aqui todos os palestrantes,
I would
também
like
venham compor a mesa.
to
Catherine
call
Ismael,
everyone here,
Ricardo,
Catherine
e igualmente a
Ismael,
professora
Ricardo,
Zoraide, da
and Professor
Universidade Federal do Rio Grande
Zoraide
do Norte,
of
os nossos
the
debates.
University from Rio Grande do Norte for our debate.
Eu passo a palavra, então, de pronto para a
I
professora
give the
Zoraide.
floor to Professor
Dizer que
Zoraide.
também para mim é uma honra,
And
né?
to
Nós
say
temos
that for me is
dois
an
representantes da
honor,
Faculdade de
we have
Direito
two
aqui da
representatives
Faculdade
of
de
law
Arquitetura. Isso é muito bom.
University,
Isso
your
demonstra
law
quanto nós
college,
já
and this shows how
tentamos fazer
much
esse
we've
exercício da
been trying to do
interdisciplinaridade aqui na
this
Mackenzie,
exercise of
com a professora Angélica, com a
interdisciplinarity
professora
in the
Eunice,
university
com
with
uma
Professor
série de
Angélica,
professores e
Eunice,
professoras
as
aqui
several
do corpo
professors
docente. Então,
from
de
the
pronto, passo a
teaching
palavra
group.
para a professora
So give
Zoraide.
the floor to Professor Zoraide.
Bom, muito boa tarde
Good afternoon
a todos, todas e todes. Mais uma
to
vez é um prazer estar
everyone.
aqui
It's
nessa
a
semana
pleasure to be here in
fantástica,
this
né, de
week.
experiências e
Fantastic
trocas.
week of experiences
E
and
o tema da
exchange.
mesa, ele é
And
provocativo,
what we've
né?
been
Pensar a
talking in this
governança
table is
climática
provocative,
tempos
thinking
de
about
crise e de
climate
responsabilização.
change in terms
Isso
of
exige a
crisis
gente
and
pensar, né,
responsibilization,
sobre
accountability.
o que a gente está
And it's
chamando de
important to,
responsabilização, né?
we talking about
No
accountability
contexto de uma
in a
crise
context of a
que,
crisis
né, se torna agora
that
não mais
becomes
anúncio, mas uma realidade,
not an
que é
announcement
sentir que
anymore,
vivida
but a
sobre
reality in the
dimensões,
sense of
forças
being
bastante
lived in
diferenciadas.
dimensions and
E
strength
pensar
that
na
are very
governança
differentiated.
é sempre
Thinking about
pensar numa
governance is
perspectiva
always
da
think about perspective of
multifuncionalidade de diversos atores, os
functionality of
atores
several
públicos, os atores
players, public
sociais, os
players,
atores de
social
governo,
players,
a
government,
sociedade no seu sentido mais amplo, mas
society,
também as pessoas, as populações,
and
as
also
comunidades,
people,
que nos
population,
protocolos e
communities,
nos modelos
that
né,
within
que
the
a gente
protocols
conhece
and the
governança
templates
muitas
that we
vezes
understand
não ocupam os
in
mesmos lugares de
governance,
fala.
we
E
doesn't
isso acaba
occupy the
implicando
same places
em
and
repercussões,
implies in
né, e no alcance que
repercussions
a própria governança pode
and the
ter
reach of the
como
governance that
instrumento,
might
né,
have as an instrument, horizontal
que
instrument,
esses diferentes
where
sujeitos e
these
atores
different
podem estar
subject and
construindo essa
players
mudança
can
de
constitute this
responsabilização
change and
diante dessa
responsabilization
crise.
in face of the crisis.
Mas
But
a gente precisa considerar também
we need
alguns
to
aspectos,
consider
né?
some aspects
Já que a gente está aqui no
because we're
contexto
here in the
bastante
context that
provocativo
is very
dos casos
provocative
apresentados
of the
aqui
cases presented here by
pelo
Catherine,
Paulo, no
Jean
caso de Porto
Paulo,
Alegre, do
in the case
Ricardo,
of
de uma
Porto Alegre,
proposição, né?
Ricardo, and the
E a gente tem que
proposition.
pensar
And we
também
need to
que fica muito
think
explícito
about,
nos três
that is
casos
very explicit
apresentados,
in the three cases
diferenças,
presented,
né, de
differences
realidades, de contextos.
on realities and
E nesse
contexts.
aspecto, eu sempre
In this
insisto,
sense,
quando eu
I
discuto
always
situação
insist
climática, que a
when
gente
I
tem que
discuss climate
qualificar de onde a gente está
situations, we have to
trabalhando,
qualify
pensando
where
em
we are
proposições,
and think
respostas,
propositions, responses, spacing. We have several differences, clear differences, thinking about climate situation and its differentiation, structural differentiation between countries from the north and south. There's no way of mixing everything in the same play because we have dynamics and characteristics that are absolutely different. For us to think about what Paulo brought, a citizenship that is environmental. I might add, it is a climate citizenship as well to think more effectively. And we always need to remind or remember that the structuring and differentiations are very explicit. And when Catherine say we have a structuring of action plans and the focus comes from a perspective of construction and reduction of emissions from a systemic approach, but at the same time we say that there are institutional institutions depend on the law for us to restructure it. So in our case, it's even deeper because we don't only have a structuring base of the law, but that doesn't work, but we have scarcity of resources and not only finances, not only money and funds, but also scarcity of ideas to develop this and to make these resources effective. This is very complex. When we think not only Brazil, but Latin America, global south, and that has these dimensions that are very differentiated. In this perspective, thinking about climate justice presents in a structural way that is differentiated as the cases that were presented. And I always think in this sense, the idea of justice. Justice is born from a classical between the doctrines of what is possible and not. And when we transpose this perspective to think about climate justice, and we need to think about a climate justice that recompose social justice as well, because we're talking about inequality, but we still need to rebuild, resetting, and opportunities to make the base of a differentiation that is the limit and with much more exposition and sensitivity of what we have in the global south. In this sense, it's very important for us to notice that we need to go forward in the perspective of public justice and climate justice in our context of 5,000, more than 5,000 cities, that the structure of the territories and urban are very differentiated. And as I said in the first day, what I define in 3D cities, differentiated in its structure, space structures and dynamics, unequal in the social sense, and in regards of the development, urban, economical, human capital, and finances that are going to have impact on this development, because a state like Rio Grande do Sul, that is the fourth economy of the country, is impacted. Every public accounts of Rio Grande do Sul were reset in regards of the disaster. Can you imagine if we got all these capitals and if all of them are affected by the same dimensions that were to happen in Porto Alegre? This country collapses. Will collapse because we won't have conditions to answer, respond in an emergency to restructuring. So it is important for us to understand that this justice conception, talking about the absences as well, the absence of urban structuring, territory that is inadequate, deficit, or inexistent.
As pessoas não vão ocupar encostas
because
porque
people
querem.
are not,
Elas são
people
pressionadas,
does
né,
not
a
get
ocupar.
to
Elas
these
não vão
areas,
morar, né,
irregular
nas áreas de
areas, because they
córregos
want.
porque
It's
querem.
because, it's not because
Elas
they want,
são
or next to the rivers,
importunadas, elas
they're
são
pressed,
levadas.
they're taken
E nesse contexto
by
de
society.
assimetria,
And in this
no
context
contexto
of
em que a gente
asymmetry, and in a
precisa, no
context
caso do
where we
Brasil,
need, in the case of
pensar uma
Brazil,
estruturação de
to
transição
think a
energética
structuring of
pautada
energetic
fundamentalmente
transition
na
based
adaptação,
mostly in the
para que a gente
adaptation
possa atuar sobre
for
as
us to
vulnerabilidades
work on the
múltiplas,
vulnerabilities,
porque elas
multiple
vão se
vulnerabilities,
sobrepor. Elas não
because
vão se
if
cruzar,
not, they're
Ricardo,
going
elas
to
vão se
overlap.
sobrepor e vão
They're not going
pressionar
to cross, they're
para
going
que
to
essas
overlap and
injustiças,
press
né, sejam
for
mais
these
amplas.
injustices to be more
E isso
broadened.
faz com que a gente pense
And
como a gente
this
pode,
makes
no
us
contexto
think on how can we,
tanto
in the
global, do
context,
norte
both
global,
global,
quanto do sul
north
global,
and south,
trabalhar essas vulnerabilidades
work
cujas
these
dimensões vão ser
vulnerabilities
totalmente
where these
diferenciadas e que
dimensions
a
are going
gente
to be
acaba
differentiated and we
reproduzindo
end up
padrões.
having
E
repercussions
nesse
on the
aspecto,
patterns.
né,
In this
eu gostaria
sense,
de colocar para
I
a
would
professora
like to
Catherine
add
e
for
para Ricardo
Professor
e Gianpaolo
Catherine
alguns
and
questionamentos.
Ricardo and Gianpaolo
É
some
possível a
questions.
gente ter
Is it
responsabilização e
possible
governança
have
climática
the accountability
pensando
and
que
responsibility
os planos de
climate,
ação climática,
thinking
sobretudo
about
como
the
eles são
plans
estruturados,
as
no
structuring
caso brasileiro,
management? In the
somente
case
12
of
cidades
Brazil,
têm
only
flags,
12
como a gente pode
cities
ampliar
has that.
para diminuir
How
as
can we broaden
vulnerabilidades e
to
ampliar
increase the
a justiça
vulnerabilities
climática
and
e a cidadania
broaden
ambiental,
the climate justice and
considerando as nossas
citizenship,
diferenças estruturais.
considering our structural
E
differences?
os
And
professores, né, que são mais
professors
ligados
that
ao
are
direito
more related
ambiental,
to
ao
law
sistema de direito de forma mais ampla,
and the law
inclusive
system,
constitucional, né, professor?
including
Como a gente
constitutional,
pode efetivar
how
a
can we
cidadania
make
ambiental
effective
no
the
cenário que prevalece no
environmental
Brasil,
citizenship with the
cidades
scenario we
3D,
have in Brazil
que
in 3D
apenas
cities,
uma minoria
and that is just a
consegue navegar
minority that can
em tempos de
navigate
exposição
in
e
terms
desastres
in times of
socioambientais e
exposition
climáticos.
and
Bom,
disasters.
uma provocação e depois
It
nós
is a
abrimos para os
provocation,
debates
and
da
then we
plateia. Muito
open for the
obrigada.
debate on the audience. Thank you.
Passo a palavra, então, na ordem.
I give the
para a
floor
professora Catherine,
to
Ricardo e
Professor
Sueli.
Catherine. Ricardo,
Se quiserem se manifestar.
if you want to say something.
The translation is still going on, so I didn't understand the full question. Can you maybe repeat the question in English or
Zoraide,
it's still translating?
você quer repetir a pergunta? How can we deal with...
Como é que a gente pode pensar?
Pode falar em português que eu tento traduzir para ela como é que a gente pode pensar, porque aí fica a pergunta...
So, yeah.
How can we think about a climate, okay, how can we think about a climate change plan, taking into account the differences between countries and cities and and Brazilian cities and in Germany, in your cities, how can we deal with these differences and think about these climate change adaptations plans in local ones?
Okay, so thank you for the question and the
Obrigada pela
your
pergunta
additional framings.
e
What we did
esses
in the
comentários.
research project is that we worked with scholars from the different countries, and we will publish a book on that also. So here in Sao Paulo, I worked closely with Deborah Soto. Maybe some of you will know her. She's a lawyer here working also with the city of Sao Paulo and with USP as a researcher as well. And so we've been collaborating, and they all researchers from those 8 different countries, lawyers, all of them lawyers, contributed and wrote chapters on how climate action planning and the legal framework for it in the field of mitigation and adaptation, caters to giving cities tools and funding for doing that or not. So we try to, give all the local voices space to actually talk about where the different countries stand. And so from what I learned from my colleagues, for example, my one of my PhD students is from Cairo, and he's doing that for Egypt. And in Egypt, we then built a different form of accountability analysis framework, because Egypt is a very authoritarian run country right now. So he is writing about how accountability and authoritarian regimes go together. Has analyzed more than 200 climate actions in Cairo that were brought from the bottom up or from a top-down system, and sent them through this critical accountability authoritarianism lens to better understand where climate action stands in Cairo currently. So we try to do justice to the local circumstances and just understand diversity. And from what I have learned from my colleagues so far in Brazil, so I don't know, but from what I have learned and what I have seen, is you are totally right. So the discrepancies, the injustices, we also have injustices in Germany, also discrepancies between rich and poor and intersectionalities, and we work with the same climate justice framework as you presented. And you can do that in German energy transition cases, having wind farms in the Black Forest, and communities are opposing it, and it's not getting built, and the municipalities are usually planning it. But the disparities are not, by far, not as large as they are here. So it's a completely different story. So there's, we can talk about it and exchange, but it's nothing really to compare, or learning also has to happen in somehow different dimensions. Not that you could, whatever, like take Hamburg's climate action planning and do it here. So this is not the idea. The idea is really understanding diversity and learning from one another and being sensitive to these issues, and also, for example, having a presentation, as we heard before, on the energy transition in the north, as you presented, having such a presentation in Hamburg when they do the next climate action plan and consider buying green hydrogen from Brazil to reach the mitigation targets in Hamburg. So this kind of exchange, I think, is necessary also.
Thank you, Zoraide, for the question. If I understood the question correctly, the topics that you proposed on how to increment, how to these plans into the city, how to make it work in the cities, I will consider as the kickoff, the end of today's morning presentation, when the two participants from the communities were the Moema panel. Moema participated. They were talking about how to engage the young people to be worried about what is happening now, and they get aware of what is going on. And we talked about engagement, language, using the internet, all these things that we think would be the right way to do it, but we have no access because there is no media, there is no press, there is nothing. So I think that we have to see that all the discourses, everything we are saying here is invisible. It is something that is completely invisible. Does not, people do not think about it. It is something that is not considered in the political agenda. It's not treated in the elections. It's not mentioned in their proposals. it is simply an invisible topic.
A partir dessa consciência, a gente
And from this awareness, we try to find out ways
sei lá, de
to
ultrapassar esse problema.
maybe overcome this problem.
De minha parte, eu acho que
This is
lá
this is
na
it
nossa
from my
cidade,
side.
onde a gente vive lá no Nordeste e que a poucos
We are
quilômetros a gente
there
tá
where
no
we live in the
semiárido,
Northeast, and so
milhões de pessoas
it's
no
semi-arid, 30 million people live in the semi-arid climate, and
Eu gosto de ler as coisas
scientist from
participa
Ceará,
do IPCC,
he participated
ele
by
diz o seguinte,
PCC, and he says, I will quote his
começa
words.
errado na
We
comunicação,
start
e
wrongly in
IPCC
the
começa errado na
communication, and
comunicação, quando ele
IPCC
diz,
starts wrongly when they say
limite em
we
e
have to
né? O
keep
máximo é
the
2, mas
limit is the maximum is
nós
2,
somos
but
ali
at least 1.5. We are 1.2, almost 3, 1.3, okay.
Isso é
This
uma forma errada de comunicar.
This is the wrong way to communicate this, because on the seaside there in the north, I was talking to Professor Cristiano yesterday, he works with this measure. In my city, the temperature has increased by 3 already. In the semi-arid, it's 5. People are being cooked, like they're being cooked and they are not realizing that they're being cooked alive. Professor Maresi said that until the end of the century, the semi-arid will be warmer than 6 or 8 degrees. Who can survive? Rice, corn, rice no, beans, corn, manioc. What kind of crops will resist this increasing temperature without these new seeds, these GMO seeds? So which water are they going to drink? So we have to think about moving 30 million people from the semi-arid to the cities, which are already facing terrible problems. So I really do not have the answer to your questions, Radin. And it is really I'm now pessimist about it, I think we have to maybe try this recognition, because our discourse is only here, in the academy. We cannot cross the barrier. Thank you, Professor Catherine, Ricardo, Professor Ismânio, gently, because for us, we speak a lot. So it's not that we want to go beyond, right? We are to cross the barriers of the university, and for that reason, so we can dialogue, I would like to open at least a question. So we could, or maybe you can ask many questions, try to be brief and direct, so we can talk about it, talk about the topic, okay?
Professora Ana Paula.
Bom, muito obrigada pelas
Well,
apresentações.
thank you for the presentations. They were excellent presentations. I would like to mention some points very directly. When we talk about climate justice, we focus on the vulnerable communities that are the most affected by climate change. They need more infrastructure. On the other hand, the technological standard, the production in these cities also affect strongly the way that they resist to these climate changes, considering that this technological standard is what should be changed. I would like to understand a little bit more what can be done from the point of view of building legal basis for this technological transition that is so centered. we have different from when we reduce CFC emission in order to contain the expansion of the ozone layer there. It was just one economic chain that was affected by this component. But carbon is the opposite, it is in every productive sector. So I don't know, maybe when it comes to climate justice and we go to the more vulnerable, which will certainly must be addressed, but I think we stop, maybe not thinking about this right of carbon emission or have better tools in order to reduce the emission and production, social and technological, of those disasters. Another point I think is important, let's make clear that we have seen in the research we have conducted, is that there is a lot of resources, there are many resources being invested in infrastructure and for the damage and the risks caused to the communities, but we do not have the tools to build, economic measures of it. We had a very nice discussion there in the other room because we couldn't count, we couldn't measure the cost for the public sector to rescue a community that was affected by certain disasters in the economic sense, to say how much the state is investing on production and trying to recover. There is no economic effect there that is maybe taken from our. These are the points I would like to share with my colleagues, considering that this is the roundtable that launches the topic in this Climapolis project. A very brief and objective question from the Harvard University. Law can be used as a tool to promote climate justice, but also to promote climate injustice. We have some cases by several companies that who are promoting climate injustice, and I am not from this field, my background is not law, but don't you think that in this debate there is a little bit bias? So we are looking what can promote climate justice, and maybe we are not paying too much attention to litigation or how to avoid the law being used to promote climate injustice. And in the case of the public ministry, it was November 2023, so it was before disasters this year. So I would like to know if you had what you learned from this experience. My question is for both the prosecutors, but especially for the prosecutor in São Paulo. I am the one who spoke about Porto Alegre. I'm Daniela. Of course, it's a very direct question from an engineer who worked for 20 years there in the front. And I was extremely frustrated with all this that happened there. The public ministry, and I went there for the public minister in Rio Grande do Sul. I became friends to many of the prosecutors. Probably you know these people. But the public ministry for us didn't mean an ally. They always meant problems. We, public servers, career ones. And I was one of the few who could develop long-term a different view in the public ministry. But if you talk to any colleague of mine, engineers there in the city hall, they will say that the public minister hinders. I don't agree, but that is how they see. They imagine that the public minister disturbs, they hinder more than they help. A third of this for a city of Porto Alegre, they do. There is a master plan which is structured from the 50s or even before. So they have this planning detailed, all the risk areas. How do you intend to effectively implement this follow-up? How are you going to act as an ally? how do you intend to monitor or help avoid this the utility that 15 years ago used to have 2,000 employees, now they have less than 800, and then they are accused of not providing good service. So how those fantastic items can really become concrete actions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone, everything that you made, all the questions you asked, that will lead us to reflections that go beyond this table this day, and we will be able to discuss this during coffee break, because unfortunately we have an interpretation time, and then the organizers asked me not to have questions, but I said yes to the questions. Let's be democratic, and maybe these questions are very fruitful, and we can start our dialogue. Thank you very much. I was the first to raise my hand, and you are going to. This is not democracy. No, so please, you can ask your question. I am also from Porto Alegre. I am a professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. I had a beautiful, wonderful project there. It was a environmental network after this disaster, this last disaster that happened in May. The state government listened to me, federal government. So we are completely discredited. The university is not hurt. And it's beautiful, like my colleague said, an engineer. The letter, the proposal is wonderful, but how is it going to be implemented? All those actions. What is the way we can really demand for something? This has to be done. Where are the funds coming from? Because we need a lot of money in order to do that. In this project of this network, it's something around 200 million in order to implement the risk maps, to have a robust system for the prediction of the disaster, implementation of equipment, radars that are non-existent. We have no basic data, the necessary data. So how can we work in such situation of climate injustice? I really do not know.
Semeando possibilidades, semeando uma maneira de ver e de olhar. Eu acabei de escrever um artigo e eu escrevi relatando justamente o que eu vivenciei. Numa sexta-feira, aqui em São Paulo, eu fui...
On a Friday here in São Paulo, I was there. I had to pick up my daughter there in Guarapiranga, and there was a storm, trees that fell. I couldn't go through, and I said, okay. I asked people to help me to remove the tree from the road, and we could free the road. So we know that together we can, and this is what we need to do. This is the exercise we will have to do.
cujo tema é desastres e adaptações.
Which topic is disasters and adaptations and organization of Professor Gabriela de Júlio, Professor Pedro Jacob e Eduardo Grisi. So please check important contributions to our debate.
Só configurar o seu botão.
Vamos fazer um teste?
Let's try it.
Mas você entrou naquele link anterior que eu tinha te mostrado, né? Então, eu vou confirmar isso.
Você vai teoria. Isso. Não ouvindo nada, né? Tá fechado. Tá.
Mas o link é esse, tá? Yes.
Yeah, because that's the right link, right?
Vamos começar? Faz a aplicação. E aí, se dessa ali, a gente tenta arrumar isso de vez, tá? Aí você faz o celular, a gente tenta arrumar, senão você vai para o celular dessa minha. Então, eu vou passar para você. Você tem o que você precisa? Você pode, então, dar anunciar a mesa.
I will hand it over to you then,
Panelistas.
and you can invite the panelists to stage.
Boa tarde.
Good afternoon.
Nós vamos dar início a mais uma
We are
sessão
going to start one more session
seminário.
of our
Nós
seminar.
vamos agora,
We
na
are
sessão-
going now
nós vamos agora nessa sessão.
in this
ouvir dois
session.
palestrantes.
We are going to listen to
Nós vamos
two
receber
speakers.
Martin Kohler,
We are going to welcome Mine Callers from
Research in the Leupan University, Alemanha.
Research and Development University in Germany. He is a strategic consultant in Germany and works in the area of supply, creative laboratories, computer science, and urban spaces, communicator, facilitator of cooperations, and transdisciplinary combination, Martin Kohler. And also Nelson Brissac, who is graduated in sociology by the Sociology and Politics School of PESP with a master and doctorate in philosophy by the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo and Sorbonne, respectively, and now an assistant professor at PUC in São Paulo with the experience in the area of architecture and urbanism focused on images and cities.
Eu pediria agora para a gente,
So
pedir
I
ao
would
Martin,
like
se
to
puder subir,
invite Martin to the
aqui
stage
à mesa,
please, for his presentation.
Can I have a hand microphone? Yeah. All right. I think it's right. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organization to invite me. Talk about transformative science so late at the end of the day, almost at the end of the conference. That's why my special thank goes also to the audience that you're still fresh and fine and looking forward to hear my talk. I try to make it short. I try to keep the 15 minutes. I'm not exactly sure if I can make it because I did the slides that just last night. I finished them. See how it goes. All right. My talk is about transformative sciences in challenged urban settings. I'm talking more about the transformative science part, less about the challenged urban settings, but I think they are included. I'm working at the Herion Institute here in Centrum, which is a research institute for the Helmholtz Society. I'm there as a strategic advisor for transformative sciences. So we have our task is actually to see how to introduce transformative science in a research institution. So that's why kind of frames parts of the talk. Also, I'm at the Leuphana University, a public university next to Hamburg. They work in the computer science department, and I'm the head of creative space. Creative space is something similar to this. That's what some of the projects we have done in Hamburg on a similar creative space. And so we do crazy things that are more or less useful. So by example, we have produced an air quality cocktail. That means based on the actual measurements of air quality, it creates a cocktail that with artificial flavors that resembles the air quality at that very time. So probably it's a good idea to not have it in the evening, but rather in the morning. Maybe the Sao Paulo edition might be a little bit different from what we have in Hamburg. It was one of these pop science projects. It's actually really a kind of direct translation about the measurement data and putting it into some kind of composition of a cocktail. And of course, it doesn't make sense. You won't open a bar with that, but it's a very good tool to interest many different people from different disciplines into something like air quality, something that you can't smell, you can't see. Actually, you have just abstract data that is very important to you because basically you could die of that. So we are doing these kind of things, and that was actually my first project that I did at the Leuphana University. That is the kick-off meeting for a project where young researchers working together with professors and developing some project in the field of artificial intelligence. So I invited them for the kickoff, and usually that is something where everybody comes there and explains why they are so useful. So what is their expertise, what they're doing, what they want to do in that. I invited them actually for having a 5-course dinner. The thing that the little surprise for the 5-course dinner was that actually I did not cook it. I just bought the ingredients. And so when they arrived, then they've been kind of surprised because I asked them now to actually prepare in groups the 5 courses so that we came together. And what was really incredible, because they came with this framing, they wanted to be really presenting why they are so important for the project, but suddenly they found themselves in groups working together, producing a salad, or it was a smashed Asian cucumber salad in the morning. Then we had the watermelon gazpacho. Next was sweet hearty skewers. The main course was then a barley couscous. And in the end, we had a stick and tiramisu. Yeah, it was really cool. I loved it. Actually, I was hungry. That was doing this project. No, but it was very important because the people really started to connect to each other. And so it was the very first base when they started to kind of work in groups together. Food is something you can always do. You can always talk about it. So you had already the first connection that actually really bypassed all the status questions, all the kind of different disciplines and experience coming from a certain discipline or something. And people really tried to start to open up. And so, by example, this is the dean of the faculty who actually, in the course when we had the dinner, talked about how he was actually hacking as a in his young ages. He was hacking digital games so that people could play them without actually paying for that. And I mean, this is something that you probably would not expect from a dean. That was very important because it brought the people into a kind of constellation. They really started to be kind of meaningful for each other, being curious what the other person could bring to the table. And that is something that really was for me, part of the starting for such a project, because, and now I borrow a quote from Nico, because you can't force people to integrate. So that means actually all the transformative projects working with different disciplines is actually something where you have to see as an invitation, provide context and platforms where people really would like to start be interested in the other person, and then you can start working. That's why I actually use this picture to show to you. Another project that I did was a big urban walk, I call it. I was walking around Sao Paulo with a group of more or less 20 people. It depended on the time of day. For the Biennale of Architecture. And the idea was actually kind of to visit different places along the line, I mean, the fringes of the city. So like a permaculture garden, a street gallery and other places that really work with this kind of how to integrate communities and coming up with different solutions for others. I think that is very important. That's why I also brought this image with me, is actually that walking is something that I really, really like a lot for doing this kind of work, because it actually makes clear and spatially kind of perceivable that when I start as a researcher and I go to a place like Italian Paulista, there's a distance between us. There's something that the distance that need to be covered, and it's not only geographical, it's also social. It depends on the experience level, and by walking, you're actually kind of you're becoming vulnerable, and you have to kind of work with the territory and what happens when I'm starting from somewhere and going to somewhere else. And I think in the context of the projects that we have seen today and in the last days, I think very interesting that as a researcher, you're not coming with a kind of the elite person with the providing the answer, but rather you're coming to a place where nobody has asked for you. And so arriving there and being transformed by the way how you arrive, I think is very important, because it brings you in a position where you can really listen and then see how and in which cases you can work with each other. That's another project that we've done in Lima, in Peru. We went to Lima and then came with a group of students, really all from the water engineering. Actually, we had this, I mean, you see these images and you think, well, the problem is water. So we have to work with a community somewhere living in informal settlements on the hills, and then we have to solve the problem of water. And we discussed it, and then actually I said, no, we are not coming with a problem. We are coming here because we want to learn. And so, but being there and trying to learn something, we have to see how other people could also learn by us being there. And so in the end, they create a very beautiful project, like in this case, where there was a small restaurant run by single raising mothers. And their problem was not water at all. Their problem was that they didn't have enough herbs, they didn't have a kind of healthy food. So we started we want to learn how to actually adapt these water providing solutions like a water treatment plant, like fog harvesting, into a context where it can be useful and how it could work there. Their problem was actually that they wanted to have some healthy food. So we made actually from the water that ran down the sink, we made a water treatment plant, and that actually feeded then the herb garden that suddenly then became part of the restaurant. And then is something that I also find very, very important doing these kind of projects, that you're not starting with the problem and not with the solution, because every problem involves your position, a certain perspective that frames already kind of what you're bringing to the table, and excludes possibilities, but also does not address like the other person might have a completely different problem. And so this way of kind of learning together is a way how you can, after a while, building a project that might be meaningful to both of you or for all the involved stakeholders. So that's why, like, as a scientist, we like to solve problems. So we're going there and we want to solve problems. And I would just say, well, you keep the problem away. We will find lots of on the way when you're doing that. So that's kind of the pretext of what I would consider transformative sciences. Transformative sciences is a project, kind of a framework for doing research that develops now quite heavily in Germany and in different notations, different labels also in other countries for understanding that. It's interesting about how science actually can have an impact in society, how it works. And so we have something like society that observes a transformation is probably a type. Another one is science that guides the transformation. And the last one, science that is a part of the transformation. To make it a little bit more colorful, I have other names for it. That is the backseat science. That is the science that climate services mostly do. So like sitting there and just shouting, there's a climate emergency, there's a climate emergency, look, it's coming, ah, shit, I told you so. You know, I mean, that's the way how we all very often do. So we work and we know everything how it works, but we're just on the back seat. And if the driver is cool and he cares for us, then it's a good combination. But if we don't have a driver or a deaf driver, then it's just on the back seat. So we're coming to the next one. That is I call it throw it over the fence science. That is the one that tries to have an impact and guides transformation. Usually we write a report. We stay in our academic discipline. We have the report, we throw it over the fence, and we just hope that it hits somebody. That is also something possible because you might have one on the other side that really is kind of receiving this report or kind of your advice and can really work with that. So usually when you're working with some like-minded politicians, then they can say, well, no, now I can use it for actually providing decisions and, you know, this kind of thing. So that's also a very good thing. But if there's nobody, then you don't hit anybody, and then you just stay, you're in your academic garden and nothing happens in the reality that is around. And that's why the last one, I call it dirty science, is where you actually, when science becomes a part of the transformation, and it actually makes it dirty. You have to get your hands dirty. You have to actually be part of the actual transformation. And that means, of course, that you can't do pure science anymore. And it means also that you're not neutral anymore. Suddenly you're becoming an activist partly, but also researcher. And so you have you're running in a lot of ethical dilemmas that you need to be solved, but solving by improvising over time in doing the research. There's no kind of golden rule book how to do that, and by being research all the time. You have to actually deal with this kind of multiple dimensions in these ways that suddenly, science becomes dirty, which is also a problem because then many journals will kind of just reject your papers because they're not done with a rigorous approach actually provides it to. So transformative science characterizes a type of research that does not only observe and describe societal transformation processes, but that actively initiates and catalyzes these processes. Therefore, scientists are actively involved in ongoing transformation process in order to learn about them. And I think that's a quote from Uwe Schneiderwind. He's director of the Wuppertal Institute and actually is a very leading figure in developing this concept. And I think it characterizes very good so that you're actually, you have to, sometimes you have to start processes in order to learn from them. Also something as researchers, we don't do that much. But on the other hand side, when we're looking at the projects that we have seen in the last days, and there are many people of us who are doing that already and trying to be part of transformation by understanding what are the critical points of such a transformation, not only the ones that you might use for paper. Very important is that for transformative sciences, these are some key characters. So it's always transdisciplinarity. That means it involves non-academic scientists or experts. The knowledge creation, the implementation happens in real-world settings. So a kind of a problem that is a real-world problem, that's actually a good starting point. Or it's a necessary starting point because otherwise other people won't be interested in working with you, and then you're the only one who has to work on the problem. Then you can do that alone in your university. It's always project-based so that you have a kind of a frame around. It's more tactical than strategic, so you have to start and then see on the course of the flow of the project how you can behave, what question you can take up, what measures are the next one. You always have to kind of implement your plan in these incremental ways. You have multiple epistemologies, and that's why you need flexible methods and methods only that guides you for the next steps rather than kind of, coming up with any kind of eternal truth. So here, especially concept and method are just a tool, and you can get rid of them if they don't help you anymore in the next step of the research that you're doing. So that's why it's lightweight in theory and concepts, and by thus producing socially robust knowledge, that means knowledge that is actually really used and can be used in many different settings by different actors, rather than verified, objective, tested knowledge, which is usually the kind of key criteria for science in long way. And it's a reflective learning and self-transformation. As I said, with the walking, by doing transformative research, it's also transformed a little bit the way how you do research and might even create a new field of research on the way. Why is that important? Because I think that could be an answer to some of the things that happen in the big cities. So here's a quote that actually really says that the cities have to be platforms for societal transformations. That's probably a quote everybody could agree upon it. And if we look in a kind of a short history of urban planning, that we see that actually we have to develop many modes how to do that and how to kind of try to bring together different conflicts in order for better learning. So it's part is a mutual adjustment. So it's a kind of planning is not there. You just have to kind of, it's an open platform for compromise and deal among the parties that are the actual users. Okay, we have the advocacy. So the planner is actually the advocate who helps the people. We have transactive planning, so where the experts' knowledge comes into kind of the communicative planning, so where you try to create the communication channels between the parties. Agonistic reality, where you say, well, it's actually also channels of expression of conflict so that emotions can come in. Trading zones, where it means we have to provide a kind of rules and set of exchanges, and then different parties can try to deal and negotiate their different ways of what they want from the planning. And critical pragmatism was that actually we are coming from different points of view, and the only thing is actually how to make them work together. So I think that is something where could evolve into something like transformative sciences, why that actually is an effort to include and engage multiple forms of theoretical, experiential, and embodied knowledge. So indigenous knowledge, knowledge from sociology, but also maybe from climate science. And this inclusive nature, together with experts from the real world, could be could be to address the breakdown of trust and expert knowledge that we are facing quite a lot. So working alongside with researchers, knowing that they are as cool as Ana Paula is, probably helps a lot to don't understand science as a kind of elite project from somewhere else. So that's what we are doing for the Herion. So we start to kind of many methods. We try to produce cool toolkits and try to learn them how to do these transformative projects. And what's very important is that you're actually always going in the circle, always incremental. So from system knowledge, that usually is something the researchers have quite a lot. You're going to orientation knowledge. So where do we want to go to? And to transformation knowledge, how do we do that? And so you're starting with something which is probably more problem analysis. And that's why I like doing that all over time. You can start with learning, but still going through this circle will in the end start to actually create problems that are worth solving within that group of stakeholders. Then you're going to vision development, by example. You will have to do some experimentation. You learn from that to disseminate, and then you start over all again. And you do that couples of times. And which is very important is that you have to do that as climate transit as CO3, which is probably a little bit surprising because I'm not talking about air. I'm talking about co-design, co-research, and co-creation. So you have to work on a level with different people from different disciplines and try to involve everybody in the research project and in a process in that sense. So it's not like the process or research is the hegemony of the research is well something that you have to do with all together so that they all can create the solution or parts of the solution and experiments together. And that actually makes it a little bit complicated because you have to work with people. You can't assume that you're the lecturer, you guide them somehow. So that's kind of something what we do to like you could start with a collaborative mapping on a floating platform. You make some vision development with some mathematical simulations. You start to build your first prototypes. With them, you are actually creating your showcases, and then you can do another mapping. And so thus you are going into the different circles. And that's a possibility to also adapt to the different time frames that the multiple actors have. Enterprises usually think in 1 or 2 years, while planners think in 10 or research and even more. And so by doing this kind of short circles on the time, you can even include people who just have 1 week time left or want to work with you for 1 year. And another thing that I can't go too much into detail to is that most of these transformative science projects that I know that are very helpful are very often kind of containerized or kind of framed as a lab. So you have different labs that, because they are kind of a project that people can address to and orient towards and work within. And that's why they're good framing for transformative science in many ways. We have, and I just brought 3 of them. That's a very old one, the Guggenheim lab one, that was kind of a mobile lab. It was a structure that developed in empty lots and started to promote there a kind of create a public space with a public academy, with a lot of researchers coming in, doing talks with a broader public, with people who are just passing by and understanding, trying to create a future for that part of the city. Another thing is like the real world lab that we've heard about quite a lot. So it's a kind of an experiment, a project that tries to, in that case, it's how to actually work on the different ecologies at the River Elbe with nature-based, plant-based solutions and doing it together with people. And another thing that I brought for me is the Gavocchio Park in Genova that was former barracks that had to be transformed into a park. And as an urban living lab, that's a bit different to a real world lab, because here we have already the idea that it is a lab, that it's a park. And so they try to create different nature-based solutions in that park in order to understand how that actually works over time when they are in use. So that living lab in contrast to a real-world lab, by example. It was also a kind of a living lab that they had new ways of work in the municipalities to work together. There's that's a kind of a longer list of living labs, other labs. I will leave you the slides later so I can go forward because I'm a little bit short on time, unfortunately. But here you can see there are many different lab types to choose from, and probably find also the one that is actually possible for your research question or your project quite well. That means there are some keys for designing transformative research. So I would say there are 5 key messages that I brought to you. So there are always ethical dilemmas associated with the creation of a transformative space in that system, also because you become political. The way how you work, the way how you do research will actually be a part in impacting the political decision that actually is not the purpose and not the function of researchers. But you can't avoid it because you're part of the transformation, but also you're part of the decision taking, apart from some others. Then it's also important to assess the readiness of a system for change before engaging it. Some are so polarized, or some are also already so fixed. That doesn't make sense to work in there in a transformative way because it's already fixed. The system is not ready for you. There's a need to balance between safe enough spaces because you work with not enough knowledge, basically, so that you can't assure the outcome. So there's always a kind of a high degree of uncertainty, and you have to take that in account, what you're providing, what you're doing, and how you work with the expectation of people, but also with, I don't know, certain technologies that might be harmful for your body. You have to work with all the methods that you can find, and they're helpful rather than the ones that your discipline requires. And it can act as a starting point for institutionalization. For that, like when we heard Christie's talk, and I thought this actually what she's done there in this pond, that was the start of a university, basically, actually with all kind of new researchers, and it could be a kind of a new institution that's much more than only understanding urban drainage systems. And now we're coming to researchers, because that's also something that I heard a lot these days. I mean, most of us are researchers, so we are actually paid for doing academic research, published in journals. And all of the things that we do there, they don't help your career. You have needs extra time. You have to find excuses for your boss. So it's something that I found a lot working with researchers and said, I really like the project. I like the goal that you're doing, but I can't afford to work with you. And we, especially in Alherion, we have this problem quite a lot. So I tried to come up with what could be the benefits for researchers. Of course, it's by working with other people, other disciplines, people from your audience. It could create an integration of new perspective that can lead to new questions, so that you class in a normal way. It's a generation of socially robust and thought after knowledge, so something that potentially can be used in transformations. I think it's a potentially new field of impact in the wake of growing demand from government and industry for sustainable solutions. So, I mean, if you have to get to net zero, then the city has to come up with any kind of new proclamations, and maybe research in such a way could be part of that and benefit from it. But this can be an access to new funding areas, probably not research institutions, but foundations, different industries and such. And also, which I also find quite interesting, that it could be a new career path, or create new career path for scientists. Because at the moment, we know only scientists who decide somewhere to be scientists, and then they have to stay within the system. But it's not the case. Many people just want to be there for a while, and then maybe working in the government. And for them, actually working these places is not a career killer. That's if you want to stay a professor, but it is something that gives you additional benefit for doing your research afterwards. And by this, I come to some things why research institutions should be changed in a way to provide better space for transformative science. And I think they should do so because they get all the money from the society, so they should work on society's behalf. And that means not only doing science for science, but also science for transformation. Not only, but also. And that means they could look into the hiring strategy. At the moment, we have a very small subset of people working in science. So by example, if you want to work for 2 years with our university, and then they will probably say, well, but we need somebody who's doing a PhD. If you say, I just want to do research, and then I want to go somewhere else, then you're off. That means we have already only people who want to become real researchers, and that is something that could be changed or should be changed. Another thing that we have to change the processes of resource distribution. Goes together with the definition of scientific excellence, because at the moment we have an innovation index, we have a publication index, but we don't have a translation index. So by example, that could be also something, a metrics that measures the impact that the research has, and that could also be part used for how to separate and how to distribute funding within an institution, because it's a choice that we say we give fund only for people with academic excellence, meaning publishing papers. Yeah, and by this, it means also kind of the capacity building for doing transformative research, and a project like the Climapolis is probably a very, very well start how to do that, so you can listen to other research and learn together how to actually work in such conditions. And by this, we're coming to something, if doing research in the classical age meant like being, plays first fiddle, and you know exactly what to do, and when is your timing, and what to do that, and with whom you're doing that, maybe we should become more something like that. So playing together like a chess band, where you have to improvise along with others and taking up cues from who's ever playing with you, and not having only kind of the first trumpet. With that, I'm finally at the end of my talk. I'm sorry that I exceeded it much, much longer. Thank you very, very much for your attention so late at the end of the conference.
Obrigado, thank you much. Bom, eu peço desculpas pelo início.
I apologize for the beginning of the presentation,
Mas eu acabei esquecendo
but I ended up forgetting to talk about the panel.
Então, o nosso painel chama-se Governança.
So our panel is called Governance and Science in Times of Crisis.
Faz parte
It is part of this panel.
Eu e Celso Sampaio,
Myself and Celso, who are the moderators, Moema, have started from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, which is my colleague, and she's here. And those who are going to present is Nelson Bizaki, who is our second presenter of the evening. Thank you.
Boa noite. Prazer estar com vocês. Muito obrigado.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to present a specific example that maybe is a starting point for us to discuss an approach from a situation. The Jardim Pantanal, it is an area of a lot of action. It's an emblematic area of floodings through the base of the Tietê River, extreme east of Sao Paulo. The project I'm going to present has three starting points. Firstly, to choose a critical situation where we can test procedures, technologies, approaches that are specific for this challenge. Second, to provoke the laboratories of the universities to exit their comfort zones and look for development or test procedures that are adequate for these situations that are more and more recurrent. And Jardim Pantanal, it is the ideal place for this situation. Thirdly, is that these procedures, these technologies to be developed with the neighbors' participation, the citizens, from the conception until the implementation of the project. Is not about a transference of technology that just lead to some procedure pre-established on the lab, hoping for this to be implemented exactly as it is. I believe that a huge mission we have learned through the years is that the philosophy and theory has worked a lot, is that projects, proposals need to be enoughly well to embrace other players, other opinions, and always open and available to be rethink and reformulated. This is an approach that gets out of the black box of technology, is a requirement, fundamental requirement for us to treat or implement new solutions that are more and more necessary. So this is the location, the general location of the so-called Jardim Pantanal. Is an irony. The correct number is Jardim Helena, and the neighbors there are called Pantanal because of the amount of water on the floodings. So this is the image. The river had a huge structuring, and it was destructed and occupied, despite the fact that they are not internalized. It suffered some profound interferences in its tracing and in its behavior. So, however, this is a typical area of the region, and the floodings are not a consequence of the invasion of the water of the river in the occupied area, but it is an obstruction. Once the flow of the river increases, they are not able to drain, so they flood on the sides. This is the main reason, because they are occupations where the territory is too high, and you have a situation of floodings, permanent floodings. This is the general picture of the place, of the territory. The first thing when we approach that area is the lack of public instruments on respect of peripheral areas. The mapping is wrong. It doesn't exist effectively available a system of information to know what is going on in the area. So before anything, we began the project in the exact moment the City Hall bought the LiDAR that helped to do the initial analysis of the topography, type of occupation, create a basic instrument of knowledge of the area, and that could be taken care of with all the players present in the area. So the effective involvement, I am a teacher at PUC University, and the effective involvement began as a requirement of the population. And what was going on in the area, what we call the risk situation, people say that is a personal risk, a living risk, a life risk. Sometimes it's not raining there, but it's raining and at the top of the river, and people drown to death. So initially, what we developed, taking in account that the systems, the alert systems, are flawed or very difficult to understand. You open a website of CETES to know, and we need a technical knowledge to effectively deal with this information. So we have a gap of information to begin with. And what we treat initially was to develop with people sensors to talk with two aspects: the draining of the water and the amount of water. The idea is not to run for the specialized, but is to instrumentalize people to read the information and get the information. We work with kits that are very simple, that allowed an involvement mostly from the youth, that rapidly understood how to reinstall the kits in areas of this type. And this was long before the project. And the people from Urbanism to have the knowledge of the territory. And the first challenge was the reading of the maps. And after the exploration and abstraction, and in another scale.
Hoje em dia foi muito facilitada pelo Waze, na verdade, né? Que é talvez a maior.
And this is through Waze, because it's our biggest school probably on reading of the territory. For incredible, as incredible as it sounds. And this is very a fundamental thing. And
as situações de interesse, as questões relevantes,
and the relevant things, information that is shared with everyone is not only talked. The reading of the map, it was object of a lot of discussions where we used to work with the maps, and the labs implicated in some strategies of interaction with public power, taking in account a process, urbanization process, even if it's low and slow and very conservative, still we have an urbanization process of the area. And we did workshops like this, where people showed on the map specific situations that would impact a work of paving in such streets. So we chose a couple of streets, and this mapping, where the mapping could be done, in the expectation of creating an interface and a discussion with public power when these projects are being implemented. So this information collected are referenced and made available from this experience. And from there, we had the lab that developed technologies, specific technologies for draining. FAU-USP developed a system of channeling to put the water down. The important thing here is that some innovation that they were produced, the modeling and the formatting for the concrete and create some parts, they related that to and to execute a prototype that is fast. This demanded a larger flexibilization of the elements that are consultative. Instead of the tubes to get in to create situations that are the and we had with the workers a work of production of different templates for this. And the interesting thing is the development of a manual that was tested in different workshops. And this is the assessment of the performance, the efficiency, and how the elaboration of the systems that is work for general use of population is effectively important and even more effectively incorporate the result of the interaction.
Está melhor agora? Então, houve desenvolvimento das formas propriamente dito, né?
We had a development. We worked in the lab through time, the adequation of design as the implementations that were done, incorporating returns of the experiments that were limited, but they were sufficient. The other project, Regina Silveira, with the poly-USP, the microstructuring dedicated to pavement. What the proposal of Regina was to design an iconography that was the face of community. The idea was always to create a public space where we have a pertaining sense from the creation of pavement that is colorful and the work, the bird, everyone suggested and elements that are symbolic of the region. We had the support, the chemical, and the pigments to make the tests, and just it's a blue sky. It's very expensive, so we just had the pigments and this beautiful yellow sky illuminating the work. So a lot of workshops were done of training, development of the designs, and the creation of a guide. This was another discussion. You see here below images. Here is a guide.
Essa foi uma segunda discussão a respeito da eficiência desse tipo de instrumentação. O laboratório desenvolveu um desenho dos pisos que fosse adequado para o escoamento entre pisos. São pisos intertravados, e, portanto, o escoamento é entre os pisos. E as canaletas têm que ser foram discutidas para permitir esse escoamento para o canto do piso, mas, ao mesmo tempo, elas não podiam ser muito largas para não atrapalhar o desenho. Então, esse equilíbrio foi uma coisa bastante discutida ao longo do processo. Formas de polistileno, o laboratório produziu formas de polistileno bastante flexíveis para permitir a desmoldagem manual. Todo o nosso investimento foi fazer um projeto que não implicasse em maquinário, inviável do ponto de vista de custos. Então, tudo tinha que ser pensado para que cada etapa do processo poderia ser feito por qualquer pessoa da comunidade, né? Não necessariamente homens especializados nisso. A participação feminina foi enorme. Então, está aqui o processo lento de minutos, o processo lento de formatação dos pisos, colocando o pavimento primeiro, o concreto primeiro, o pigmento primeiro, o concreto depois. Então, houve também um treinamento na questão da formatação. E foi negociado com o governo do Estado um protótipo a ser feito no parque. Tem um parque público que chama Parque Jardim Helena, e o protótipo a ser colocado à margem de um alagado, que, na verdade, é o restante de um meandro do Rio Tietê. Então, esse protótipo é o que está sendo desenvolvido agora. E a discussão que está sendo conduzida é por um engenheiro da Fundação Centro Tecnológico de Hidráulica, FCTH, e que ele sugeriu esse tipo de approach, que é uma tecnologia conhecida como pavimentação permeável, sem infiltração no solo, porque o lençol freático aqui é muito alto e a questão da pavimentação aqui é a mais polêmica de todas, né? Há uma enorme discussão a respeito da viabilidade de se pavimentar em áreas sujeitas à inundação, portanto, que podem ser formatadas e tudo isso. Então, essa é uma tecnologia que foi desenvolvida inicialmente pela Poli há muitos anos atrás, tem vários estudos a respeito, e, coincidentemente, os alunos que fizeram esses estudos hoje são professores aqui, da engenharia aqui do Mackenzie. Então, E, por fim, a proposta é desenvolver também nessa região, nesse alagado, um protótipo de wetland construída. A gente sabe que isso foi desenvolvido, a ideia foi discutida com os moradores longamente, tem um desenho técnico de como fazer isso, e como funcionaria esse negócio, e sabendo o seguinte: nós, em termos de tratamento alternativo de água, o Brasil tem uma carência imensa no que se refere à atualização tecnológica. A questão das tecnologias de wetland, elas são usadas hoje em dia extensamente nos Estados Unidos, na Europa e tudo isso. E aqui no Brasil a gente não tem praticamente nada, né? Não existe por enquanto, uma abertura acadêmica, técnica e, sobretudo, na gestão pública para incorporar esse tipo de discussão, que é absolutamente fundamental, né? Então, os estrangeiros relacionados a essa questão, quando vêm aqui, falam: olha, na Europa as wetlands ficam congeladas meio ano, e aqui vocês têm um clima maravilhoso o ano inteiro e vocês não fazem nada. É tudo só tratamento químico em grandes unidades da Sabesp. Bom, é basicamente isso. Eu só quero completar falando de algumas observações. Primeiro, a questão das inovações tecnológicas, a mistura científica do concreto, a modelagem, a wetland construir, o uso de lidar para mapeamento, todas essas questões são fundamentais, mas o eixo principal de discussão da gente é como viabilizar a participação dos moradores na concepção e no desenvolvimento das propostas. É essa que é o eixo principal. Portanto, a articulação entre especialistas dos laboratórios, a gestão pública e a comunidade, né? Que é uma grande tarefa. A segunda questão é a questão da avaliação das oficinas, né? As experimentações feitas com os manuais, os guias de desenho, os mapas de localização, será que esses dispositivos foram efetivamente compreendidos e utilizados adequadamente pelos moradores e, sobretudo, se eles foram flexíveis o suficiente para mudarem conforme o retorno obtido das experiências. Isso é uma questão contínua, uma investigação que a gente está fazendo não tem um objeto final, né? A outra questão, a última, é a questão da resistência generalizada a experimentações e novas tecnologias que a gente tem tanto no âmbito acadêmico, mas, sobretudo, no espaço da gestão pública, né? Então, essa é uma questão chave. Não adianta a gente falar de novos procedimentos para tratar da segurança climática e tudo isso, se as propostas não tiverem nenhum eco e nenhuma chance de aplicação. Então, é uma questão política, que, no fundo, não técnica, que, no fundo, a gente tem que se abordar com maior consciência. Então, nós fizemos também, só para terminar, uma gestão junto às comissões de acessibilidade da prefeitura, levando os projetos para que eles fossem normatizados como práticas de políticas públicas oficiais. Então, acho que é um pouco esse o caminho que a gente tem que...
I think this is what we should do.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much.
Nelson, eu já vou sugerir que você permaneça, por favor, aqui.
I will suggest you to stay here. And I will invite Martin to return to the stage.
Bom, eu acho que a gente passa agora
Well,
para
I think we will now have the second part of this meeting.
Agora já são
It's
16 horas e quase 16 horas e 10. 17
perdão,
horas.
10 past 5
17 horas e 10 minutos.
already.
E a nossa mesa
And
termina
we have
17
to
e
finish at 30 past.
Então, eu
So
vou,
I'm
na
going
realidade,
now,
tendo observado
having
por
observed
experiências
by
anteriores,
experience, and
eu não pretendo fazer
I do not intend to do any debate, no speech. I would like to hand it over straight to the audience, so we could give you the opportunity for you to ask, and so you can ask or comment. I suggest people to raise their hands, and I'm going to take notes here, the ones that want to ask or make comments, okay? So raise your hand if you have a question or comment.
Por favor, fale seu nome e a pergunta.
Please say your name and the question, okay?
Muito obrigado. Jean Leite Tavares.
Thank you, Jean Leite Tavares from Natal Federal Institute. Professor Nelson, your lecture was really exciting for us because we have some situations there in Natal that really deserve a different approach. And you have brought some things that we had in mind, but we didn't know if it was possible, and you showed it was made. So this approach involving the community, we have the situation of a touristic neighborhood, Ponta Negra, with a project for the formulation of the coast. So it's your ideas are really interesting, so we can apply them. Next meeting, probably we may show this. So, but I had one doubt: how can there was no problem before? Whenever we talk about wetlands, I imagine how to remove the communities who are in this area of the river there. When I see this in other countries, the application of wetlands, all the hydraulic thing, and I say, okay, then nobody was living there, so it's easy. But in our case, no, there are many people living almost inside the river. Huh? So how you and your team have measured this thing? How do you see this situation we have here in Brazil? Good afternoon, Daniela Benfica from Water Association. I don't want to ask a question. I'm just saying that I really loved the presentation. And to Professor Nelson, I cannot help thinking with my public sector brain. We had initiatives, punctual initiatives in many occupations. And we always had the problem that there is intervention, it is made, there is a project from an NGO or university, and then they go away and the community is there. And the municipality is in charge for the area, either formal or informal. So we had some problems because alternative solutions were used and we had no conditions to keep this. The galleries, for example. So my question is, if you did any kind of work together with the public service that will, in the future, will be responsible for it, if they are adapting to this situation, and if there is a way Because this is what I commented, that we made a mistake in Porto Alegre because there is a whole adaptation on the way of thinking the maintenance. Our employees, they don't know how to do gardening, they know how to clean pipes. So I believe that big part of the difficulty to implement is because of this. So my question is basically this: if there is any kind of integration with the public service that will be in charge of it. So first, my question is to Martin. I don't know if you can understand. You can understand Portuguese, right, Martin? I will ask in Portuguese. I liked the keys for transformative design research, the 5 main keys of the message, and I think that
o grau de incerteza trata
the level of uncertainty treats a little bit of what Daniela has just mentioned.
It is important to assess the readiness of this system for change before engaging in it. É necessário saber se o sistema.
So it's necessary to know because it is a transformation in the system.
Fazer equilíbrio.
To have the balance, the evaluation of what is safe and what is enough, safe enough for transformation, let's say. So this would be related to that basis of transformative research we were discussing the other day, or a conception that it's only possible transformative research after a rupture. No? After disruption. So how to do this? How to do transformative research without the rupture of the system? Is it negotiation that you propose? Well, and a question to Nelson. It's good to see all the development of this work. I always think it's necessary for infrastructure works, especially those that propose transformation, to have an image, to have like a brand, let's say a cultural, that would allow it to become a symbol of the project. Because the infrastructure discussion is hard. So how can you make people identify with that beyond conversation? The argumentation, the discussion, something that will become a symbol. I don't know, like a brand of this. And in this aspect, as far as I know, part of this research, the work that you develop there, this experimental work, has this objective, right?
Thanks to both speakers. I have one quick question for Nelson. You did mention about the activities, the pavement, making the pavements. You mentioned about plastic molding. But to the best of my knowledge, plastic molding, any plastic type material, when it comes to the runoff during the rain time, are the source of microplastics that will be washed off to water sources. So I'm not sure how a common practice is this, but don't you think that use of plastic creates another problem? Microplastics pollution. Just a quick question. Thank you.
It's a good question.
I'm Pedro Jacob from the Institute of Energy. I would like to make a comment for both of you. I have been learning, know a lot of Jardim Pantanal. I have worked with a hydric safety project there, and I would like to highlight the importance of this methodological discussion that Martin brought to us, but to reinforce the importance of the social articulators, because this is one of the powerful characteristics of the work there in Jardim Pantanal, Alana Institute. So we have to take into account that today in the morning, I participated in one of the decisions. The challenge is to bring the more presence of the social articulators to the dialogue that is necessary in a community in which we still live with many problems, you know, this paternalism, you know, politics. This discussion allows, so by having these articulators, we can think about the innovation that you show, Nelson, because I think it's critical. Because only with innovation, so bad conditions as we have there in Jardim Pantanal, you can make some progress. And we had some workshops in my project. It was really interesting, Martin. Can you understand, Martin, more or less? Should I talk in English? Okay.
Of the community and the people that we had in workshops to be strong actors, no? Protagonistas, and they feel also that they could talk and be criticizing what, for example, Sabesp did or didn't do or did wrong, and brought it without that we induced it, because that's what makes it different. We'll begin to think about what they really matter once they are not conducted, but they are absolutely looking at something that can be transformative in their daily life.
Obrigado. Depois da Ana Paula, a gente encerra as perguntas.
So thank you very much for the presentations. I learned about the subject, and I would like to point out that when I had proposed this title for this round table, the perspective is to bring for us that the transformation is not a process outside us. We should transform our way in which we are in the process. So I think when we put on the table the perspective of creativity, we can break this black box of ideology and technology, because I think there is a connection between this black box of ideology and left-wing ideology and the conservative black box of technology. So I'm very grateful. You had done a great job. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Bom, eu pediria então.
I would ask them, if possible, to Martin and Nelson, if you could share the time you have now. Okay, so we have 10 minutes.
Brevemente, então, adorei questões.
So very briefly, I love the questions just to start with. I will briefly answer your question about the wetland. Of course, that wetlands require a big space in order to be implemented. It has to be relatively big. It has to be a wetland that is not occupied. It leads us to the question that you pointed when it comes to maintenance and costs, because the technologies, we have to keep in mind that technologies that are based, nature-based solutions or nature-based technologies are really fragile. It's the opposite of doing something gray structure that you place there and it's okay, and it would resist the interventions, I would say. So nature-based technologies imply a relation with nature, the behavior of the nature. So they are really propense to be destroyed if there is brutal interference. Okay? When it comes to maintenance, it's even more important than the implementation itself, the implementation of the infrastructure, because the participation of the residents from the beginning is sine qua non condition for this. the public sector do something with good intention, but if there is no relation with the residents, will be abandoned, you know, destroyed and so on. So if the infrastructure is not understood as something that belongs to the community, it won't be sustainable. So this is something that we have to learn. Public sector has to learn this, and the ones who develop technology must learn that. Now, the more it is complicated to understand, because of course there is a difference in knowledge, technical preparation, the discussions we used to have there in the poly lab, is that they developed a mixture of sandwich that was really appropriate for the discussion, that was really good for it, and they demanded that the pavement were made with this mixture. You know, the resident, you know those residents. They know, let's put a little bit more salmon, just a little bit more, you know, to ensure. So, and people got crazy with that. So the discussion about sustainability, this is a discussion that implies in deep cultural roots. What we have the most there are churches and building material, construction material. These are the two things that you have the most. You buy sacks of cement, you take home, and you make floor. And why doing that? Because they do this, né? So they are the employer do this, né? So we work with technology, for example, with the resident. There in Pantanal, 99% of the people came from the northeastern region. All of them lived in these, you know, these houses in the wattle and daub, you know, composite material. So and it's a shame, you know, living in this house on stilts. Why that? Why do you want to do this? Né? So it's because our employer does this, they use cement. So we have some deep cultural issues to be treated. What will then lead to what Anelo said when it comes to image, recognition, something that says, this is mine. This is me. I've made it. This is the knowledge I have. So the idea of bringing artists, in the case of Regina Silveira, the idea of having them is that art has this capacity of touching, you know, the wound. And science, because science has not. So art pushes something, you know, like, which is the limit of technical rationale and everything. There is one thing or the other. Okay, so articulation, the most difficult seems to be to make, you know, artists live with engineers and architects. It's hard work. Let's say it's the most difficult of all. So it's the hardest part, I would say. So it's a complex work, but something that we must do. And just to conclude, when it comes to the plastic molds, the use of plastic that Daniela mentioned.
Some of the projects, they use wood or paper, thick paper. In this other situation, was necessary to use plastic. Also because should be easy to mold on this mold, and could not be done by wood. Paper is not strong enough. So we still have this problem. We should not try to resolve a problem and create another one, right? I know. It's like we use plastic bags garbage. So, so let's think about this problem.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really happy to be on the panel here together with you and showing your, I mean, kind of make more concrete what can be done in that. And Renato, you're really overestimating my Portuguese account. So I'm very thankful as well that you brought the question to me in English so that I can respond to it a little bit more. I would like to start with the one like with uncertainty and a safe enough space. My concept of real world experiments goes back on a publication in 2005 from Manfred Gross. And he started actually that when we work in ecological or socio-technical systems, then we do have a problem because the normal experiment in the laboratory doesn't work anymore because everything is interconnected and you have so many kind of feedback loops that you cannot actually learn in some what you usually do. That means we have to go actually into the real world and learn from doing there something. And then we get into the problem that we will never have enough knowledge that we can really produce a estimation what will happen if we do something. But that means we cannot act. And if we have a present problem, then we need to act. So that means we have to make this compromise, kind of working in the real world and starting to being aware and customize for that it is in the real world. And so that we always have the kind of a certain degree of uncertainty that the outcome is a surprise. On the other hand side, I mean, this is actually the benefit of that because a surprise is usually something that might be much more interesting for kind of second degree innovation. So in that sense, it kind of is a payoff. But of course, all the time you have to consider whatever you do, working with communities, raising expectations, starting to kind of work in the Greek and just trying to make the flow that it can go wrong. And you have to be very close to the process and working very incrementally in that sense and always try to learn from what you're doing and learn that together with others. Also kind of sharing, like not doing that alone as a researcher, but doing it together with communities. So many people have an eye on that to kind of see if there's something going wrong. So I think this is very important. And then coming to Pedro's question about, of course, when you do that as a researcher, you're creating a political stage, you're creating a debate, you're creating a space of emancipation from that can be used from people. And that is also part of the problematic case. It can be the benefit because as a researcher, you can't resources that are more than other groups have, and that's why you can bring it into such a space because I think it is necessary that we have a political stage there. It's necessary to bring it up to the point that the public service have to look at that and just come up with an answer. So in that sense, that I think it's very important and it's part of it, and it actually needs other people who take the stage because you're just a guest. And that brings me to the last question, actually, and that is probably a question I have to myself. How can I do that, and why should I do that as a researcher? I can do that as an activist. I can do that as a resident. I can do that as a normal person. So in the end, I'm a researcher coming to that space and suddenly taking up different hats. But what can I answer if somebody asks me, so it's a kind of a complicated way of doing urban planning? You know, having so much time, so many people working on that and doing a pavement, and then you could say, well, yes, of course, it should be actually easier, and it's a problem that we have to come, but in the end, it's an urban planning design. And that's why, for me, it's so interesting to think about, can I take something, what happens there, and transform it into a research question? It's something that I can work and bring into the academy as a question that needs to be solved, and especially nature-based solutions. I think it's absolutely like with the wetlands project. You can't learn, or you need to learn so much about actually doing that and doing that together with others, how to transfer ownership, how to actually work with different kind of disseminations that get into that. And that is a question for research, and that's why it's possible to do that, and not only as an activist. So I think that would be my final answer to also a little bit to what you have said to me.
Então, quero agradecer e acho que com isso
So I
nós
would like to
encerramos.
thank, and with that, we close this meeting, this panel.
Então, eu gostaria de
So I
convidá-los
would
para a
like to invite
conferência
you for the conference that we are going to have at 6:30
nessa mesma sala.
You are all invited in the very same room.